I encountered something that I can't quite explain, so bear with me, because I'm going to give you the story in full, every detail I can remember, the entire story, all the way to the very end. So, without further ado, here is my encounter. My dad retired from his job recently, but his career used to take him to all sorts of places around the globe. When I was young, I can't imagine that I was any older than 10 years old at the time. He had taken up a project which was located in Rio de Janeiro. My mom figured if my dad was going to be in Brazil for a couple of months, our family might as well reunite with him during a nice vacation there. They ultimately planned to stay at a resort in the Amazon rainforest. While we're not exceedingly rich, I'm from a pretty well-off background, so such trips were viable for my family to make. Typically, time was more of an issue than money when it came to things like that. It came time for vacation, and we reunited with my father in the resort's lobby. Since he had traveled all the way from Rio, the rest of us from Austin, our entire family was exhausted, so we didn't expect much that first night, except to get dinner. The place was pretty nice. It was widespread and airy, and had a warm breeze to it. Despite its openness, the resort was secluded by a dense array of trees, giving it a sense of privacy. After dinner, we walked back to our hut. It was pretty dark by now, but the soft lights which illuminated both the buildings nearby and the path we were traveling down made the area feel safe and cozy. We arrived at our place and winded down by watching a movie before heading off to bed. Actual activities would start the following morning. When we woke up, we got dressed and went back into the lobby, which had a large open dining room off to its side. We ordered our breakfast, and when my mom went to use the restroom, my dad snuck me and my little brother a few sips of his coffee. I think it was the first time I'd ever tried coffee before. It made my heart race beyond what felt comfortable. Our mom returned, and we had our meal, and then headed out for the day. I remember my brother and I were a bit hyper at this point, but I'm sure our mother just wrote it off as us being excited. We were slathered head to toe in sunscreen and began to head off in a hiking trail. We got about 15 minutes into it, and my parents managed to come across a couple of other adults, except they didn't have any children. They conversed together, leaving me and my brother to talk amongst ourselves. We passed a waterfall, which I'd say was about 30 feet tall, and had a cool, crystalline blue color. Surrounding its pool, at the bottom, was a wooden fence about 3 feet tall, with signs all over it, warning not to swim. I pointed it out to my brother, and he asked why we couldn't swim in it, and I said I didn't know, but that I wanted to. He said he wanted to as well. We were so caught up in looking at the waterfall that we hadn't realized our parents and the other couple had trailed off so far ahead of us they were calling out for us. We called up to them, and once we finished our hike, parted ways with the other people. We then had lunch, did a few more activities such as kayaking and exploring whatever else the resort had to offer, and before we knew it, dinner had approached us. During our meal, our parents let us know that the couple they met invited them to hang out at the bar later in the night, which would leave us by ourselves. After dinner, we returned to our hut. Our parents took a little rest before leaving us with one of the key cards and relaying where the bar was located, in case we needed them, telling us to not let in any strangers, don't go wandering off, and so forth. Looking back, I think my brother and I were a bit young to be left alone by ourselves, but perhaps my parents had become accustomed to the resort at that point and figured it was pretty safe. A few minutes after our parents left, my brother and I were bored and trying to figure out what to do. We put in a movie, but it was one we had watched a million times before, so we were quickly bored. My brother brought up the waterfall that we had seen earlier in the day and that we should leave to go swimming. I mentioned that my mom and dad didn't want us to leave. He argued that they would never find out. Within an hour or so, we'd be back anyway, because they'd still be gone at the bar. I asked him what he thought about the signs on the fence that surrounded the pool. I remember him shrugging that he didn't know. I was tempted, I'm not gonna lie. We didn't have the chance to go swimming that day anyway, and I'd really wanted to. I wasn't sure if the pools were still open, but even then, just like how I'd seen the movies we brought along with us dozens of times, I'd also gone swimming in regular pools many times as well. I was craving something new and adventurous, and the resort offered the perfect opportunity. I figured it'd be really cool to tell my friends that I went swimming in a waterfall when I got back home. We finally agreed to go and changed into our swimming attire, bringing everything we needed with us, including the key card. We made our way to the area where we entered the hiking path and noticed a gate had been shut in front of it, although it was left open, allowing us to easily push through. We made our way down the path, and what I remember the most about it was it being loud as hell due to all the animals and bugs that were sighted within its vegetation. My brother and I argued a bit on where exactly the waterfall was and whether we were going in the right direction at all. But eventually, we heard the sound of it in the distance and picked up our pace. We arrived at the site, and it's surprisingly somewhat easy to see as the moonlight had reflected itself off of the water. We made our way over to the wooden fence, not even bothering to give a second glance to the warning signs it fostered, and climbed over. I put the cart on top of one of the fence's poles, because I wasn't sure if it would get damaged, then wet, and feared losing it in the water. My brother put his finger into the pool and asked him whether the water was cold. He said a little bit, but still made his way in. I followed. It took a bit to get adjusted to the temperature, but before we knew it, we were swimming around and splashing. The waterfall had created a current which pushed us further down the pool, so we had to make sure to not get too far away. But even then, it wasn't terribly strong. We played at the waterfall, pretended to shower ourselves with it, along with swimming behind it. I heard some odd noises in the distance, and I paused and shushed my brother. I told him to listen in. They happened again. This time, I could make out the sounds more clearly. It sounded like heavy footsteps and the squawking of a bird, and it lightly echoed across the sky. As time went on, it only seemed to get closer. At first, I was paranoid that our parents were looking for us, but I soon realized there was no way that it was a human being. My brother and I anxiously whispered to each other, trying to figure out what it was, but to no avail. Soon, a creature revealed itself in the distance, and in the dim light, I can make out a vaguely human shape. My brother asked if it was some sort of ape or monkey, and I told him I didn't know. As it moved around, it only looked more bizarre. I remember odd spiked shapes poking out of its body, and it had a long tail, which seemed to whip around behind it. It got even closer, and was easier to make out by now. The first thing I noticed was that its eyes reflected a yellowish-greenish tint in the light, and then I could make out that its body was covered in a brown-green scales, with talons at the end of each limb. It leapt across the surrounding area of the pool, and when it rested, it crouched much like a human would. It couldn't seem to decide whether it wanted to move on 2 legs or 4. Then, my eyes met its own. It let out the familiar bird squawking and dove into the water, swimming in a doggy paddle fashion towards me and my brother. We screamed, moving as fast as we could, and I didn't dare look back as we heard this thing splashing behind us. We finally got to the edge of the pool, and as I went to pull my body up, I felt one of its talons slice my ankle in an attempt to grab it. I screamed once more, and not knowing what else to do, took a shot in the dark by taking my other foot and kicking this thing in the face. It let out a hissing noise, and my brother and I clambered over the fence and ran into the forest, our arms and leg getting snugged on all kinds of plants. We eventually got our way back onto the path, but we weren't entirely sure which direction to head. Ultimately, we just took a guess. I wasn't even sure if that thing or monster was still following us, but we could still hear the noises it was making in the distance, which was enough to keep us from running for our lives. We ended up back at the gate from which we entered and ran out screaming, crying. A couple of women passing nearby stopped us to ask us what was wrong, and we told them something tried to kill us, and they asked where our parents were. It took me a moment to recollect, but I told them they said they were at the bar. They took us back to the bar, asking for our parents' names so they could call them out. After a few minutes, they came to us. We told them what we had told the women. My parents were a bit upset and pretty irritated that we left when we were told not to. But long story short, we finally got into some dry clothes and into bed, and I managed to get my wound cleaned out. Luckily, it wasn't too severe. As the women reported the incident to the resort, the next morning, the path was closed off for the day, so the staff could try and find out what we were talking about. But they told my parents they hadn't come across anything. The rest of our vacation went as normal, but regardless, it was most certainly difficult to enjoy myself after that experience, and to this day, I'm still very hesitant to go back. So, there's my story. Take it for what you will, believe it if you want, but I still think about this encounter from day to day, and it still bothers me. I don't know what kind of creatures live in the Amazon forest, but I have never heard of a creature like that, and I certainly hope we don't have creatures like that living up here in the States. This happened to be back in winter of 2012. At the time, I lived in Florida, right outside of Live Oak, right around Highway 90. In fact, I was out behind my house, hanging out with my dogs. It was the evening time, just as it was starting to get dark. For the record, my backyard has tons and tons of grass in it, and a little bit of woods all throughout. I have about 10 to 12 acres, so there is a decent amount of woods that goes on. My dogs were walking around, and started acting weird. I was asking them, what's wrong? Seeing if they smelt something, or acted different. They kept looking into the woods. Also, I thought I heard what I can only describe as movement, so I thought maybe it was a deer, since, well, there are plenty of deer up here. But they started acting dodgy, which kind of put me off. Right at that very moment, my face, my nose, my entire being began to be slapped with this awful odor. It was like a mix of skunk, wet dog, blood, death, dumpster. I can't even begin to describe it accurately. It was terrible. And just as I smelt that horrible odor, more movement began to occur in the woods around me. Both my dogs began to act really weird at this point, starting to low growl and watch closely as some animal moving in the woods started to make its way towards the opening, right where we were. Then, before I know it, even in the dusk, out stepped this shaggy animal that stood on two legs before us. It wasn't much taller than me. In fact, if I had to guess height, I would probably say somewhere between 5 and 6 feet, since I stand about 6'2". I'm not a huge dude by any means, but I'm definitely taller than most men. I was pretty utterly shocked by what I was looking at. It just sat there and stared at me and my dogs for a second, before turning right around and walking back the way it came. This thing looked like a dog that stood on two legs, covered in long, shaggy black hair. I couldn't really see the face very well, but it looked just like that of a dog. Like, I want to say a German Shepherd, but it looked different. Like the face didn't have much hair on it, if that makes sense, and the snout was a little more slender, and there was hair all around its face. It's really hard to describe. I guess the best way would be to possibly describe it like a monkey, in the same way that their faces have virtually no hair, but they have hair all around their faces. That's kind of what this thing looked like. It didn't act aggressive, growl, or make any hostile movements. It kind of came out of the woods, glared at my dogs and I, and kind of seemed stunned that we were there, as if it wasn't expecting us. It looked like it kind of had a deer in the headlights look, where it wasn't really sure what to do next, before just turning around and retreating back in the woods the way it came. I was shocked more than anything. I have never seen or heard of an animal that looked like this before. So me and my dogs went back in the house. My dogs the entire time, however, were on edge, and when this thing stepped out of the woods, my dogs still acted pretty hostile, the hair on their backs rising up, refusing to come with me. I know dogs generally chase animals and will growl at animals, but this was different. Whatever this animal was, and again, I don't know what it was, my dogs definitely did not like it. So after we went back inside, nothing really happened the rest of the day or night, and there was no sounds, no noises, nothing out of the normal. It's pretty common and I for my dogs to have our little evening time, walking around, checking out the sunset, and just enjoying the nature. I mean, I love it, but I mainly do it for my dogs, and out of all the time that I've been out here, I've never had anything weird like that happen before, nor have I ever seen anything out of the ordinary in my entire life, and I'm 36 years old, and I've been around quite a bit, out in the woods, out in the mountains. The only thing I can really think of is that people here in Florida talk about seeing the skunk ape, which this thing didn't look anything like an ape at all. It looked more like a dog that stood on two legs, which I already told you about. So unless you can tell me what it is I saw, I'm not too sure. I know there are some animals that live in the swamps, like cougars and bears, but this didn't resemble any of them. Its frame and stature and build was completely different than any of those animals. One of the most terrifying things that I've ever seen in my life happened just last spring. It was April 16th, and I was on my way to go see my brother for his birthday, who happens to live north of Lexington. I was right around Port Sanilac in Michigan, probably about a couple miles south at the time, and driving northbound on M25. At the time, I believe I was the only witness because there were no other cars on the road. But this road is not a dead back roads by any means. It is a pretty frequently driven on road in this area. For those that don't know anything about the geography of Michigan or the M25 road, it's littered and sprinkled with houses and neighborhoods all throughout, but mainly lots of heavy forest all throughout, with large pastures in between here and there. You would just have to see it for yourself. I mean, you could always drop on Google Maps and check it out on Street View if you're really that curious. In fact, I'll go ahead and recommend you do that, since it will give you a better idea of what to look for. All of a sudden I'm driving and running out of the woods from my right, crossing the road and going into the woods to my left, was what I can only describe to you as a werewolf. Now, because I've seen my fair share of horror movies in my day, I feel pretty adamant that I can give you a decent description. The thing that comes to mind the most, have you ever seen the movie Dog Soldiers? If you've never heard of it before, it's a werewolf movie that came out in 2002, and it deals with werewolves in Europe. I can't exactly remember the plot, but whatever this thing that jumped across the road looked very, very identical to the creatures in that movie. Very hairless, almost a human-like body. No hocks in the back legs. Not super ripped like a bodybuilder. Lean, but not overly ripped. The entire neck and head, however, covered in a thick mane like a lion, with the face of a very large wolf. No real humanoid features at all. I mean, maybe the body, but the face is very wolf. Very fierce and demonic looking, with large hands, just like a person's, with large claws. No tail, and again, most people describe dogmen around here, or so I've heard, that they look just like an upright dog. Hocks, tail and all. But again, this had really no fur on its lower body, and if it did, it was very minimal. The legs, again, were just like a man. I couldn't really see the feet, which is why I thought at first it was a man running in a werewolf costume, because it looked so natural in the way it ran, like it didn't have to force itself to try and run unnaturally. I hope I'm making sense to you. Then again, seeing what I saw really doesn't make sense. But then again, this is 2020, where stuff is out of control, so I guess we have to expect the unexpected. It ran in such incredible speeds that it freaked me out. I slammed on my brakes, and it's a good thing that nobody was behind me, as in just 2-3 strides, this thing had not only jumped out of the woods out onto the road, but had cleared the entire highway and off into the other portion of woods, all in just a matter of seconds. Whatever this was incredibly powerful and fast. Like I said, it scared me, especially after seeing it, and I got a pretty good look at it, even though it only peered out in the open for a few seconds. It was enough to see almost every detail that I needed to. To clarify, this happened right around 2:30 in the afternoon. It was sunny, no really clouds in the sky at all, so I had a perfect viewing of it right in front of me. To give some estimate to you about how far it was in front of my car, I would say no more than 50 feet at the very most, but no closer than 20 or 30 feet. Again, I'm just using rough estimates. Had I been going probably 10 miles an hour faster, I might have collided with it. But then again, who really knows? After the sighting, I called up my brother, freaked out on him, and told him, "Dude, you have werewolves around here." To which he just laughed at me. But once I got to his house, and after a while, explained to him what it is that I exactly saw, he started to tell me of some other stories that he had, as well as his friends. Now, it wasn't till a little later that I learned that these things were called dogmen, and that I guess they're pretty well known up in this Michigan-Wisconsin area. At the time, I didn't really know that. Even though he didn't have any personal sightings of his own, he's had many friends and coworkers who have seen the same description of a creature I have while driving to work or just being out in the area, especially here in northern Michigan. I guess up here, north of Lexington, there's a hotbed of them, and they're supposedly all over the area. I guess, in hindsight, none of this should really surprise me, as there are stretches of woodland all over, with a lake, and tons of rural farmland all along the west side along this road. Who knows what could really be living out there? I mean, after all, the forest and the area give plenty of space for something to stay hidden if it really wants to. I grew up in a very religious, conservative, and traditional household in rural Georgia. I practically lived and breathed my church, and only ever attended private schools, all the way up until I graduated. Part of the curriculum, in order to graduate from my high school, was going on a missionary trip. After a hurricane down in Florida, my school gave us the opportunity to volunteer to help feed those who were now homeless from their houses being destroyed. Most of my class, myself included, decided to go and help out. We took a bus down to an old mansion that my school had rented out. It was just far enough away from the storm to be able to not have to been touched by it. So despite its age, it was in pretty solid condition. Working electricity, plumbing, it even had air conditioning, and so forth. I was told that it was usually rented out as a venue for things like weddings, but the landowner had appreciated the school's thoughtfulness so much that he gave them a huge discount. The staff also figured keeping every kid in one area would ultimately be cheaper and easier to pull off, instead of stuffing us in multiple rooms across a hotel. All in all, I was pretty excited to check the place out. When we arrived, we were greeted by a huge lawn in which its backyard bordered a swamp. The yard had a shed, a swing set, and a garden, which included benches to sit under the trees that were there within it. The inside of the mansion was very open and bright, the reminiscent of Greek architecture. It had lots of fireplaces and somewhat unnerving statues. The bedrooms housed up to 6 people each and had strange paintings on the walls. The place even had an indoor pool, although we weren't allowed to swim in it, mostly because the adults didn't want to deal with boys and girls being scantily clad within close quarters atop of having to make sure nobody drowned. We had pretty basic rules, and a schedule relayed to us. No sneaking off, no swimming in the swamp or pool, No boys and girls' bedrooms, and vice versa. No stealing food from the kitchen, no sleeping in, and so forth. Our schedule consisted of waking up at 7:30, breakfast at 8, volunteering from 9 to 3 with a 45-minute break in between, dinner at 4, lessons from 5 to 7, being allowed to use our cell phone from 7 to 8:30, and lights out by 9. We'd start volunteering the following morning, and dinner was being prepared for us kids. So, we had time to kill. While we weren't allowed to swim in the swamp, the adults didn't have a problem with us fishing in it. So, my friend and I, let's call him Sam, had brought some gear along with us to see what we could catch. A girl we knew, we'll call her Jasmine, decided to join us and talk to us while we did our thing. She mostly talked to Sam, as I have a tendency to zone out when I'm doing mundane tasks. We ended up catching a couple things, but released them back into the water, just as we were about to finish up. Jasmine pointed out a strange shape that just poked up out of the water. My vision has always been kind of bad, and I forgot to bring my glasses on the trip. So at first I thought it was a rock, but then I realized it was a crocodile. We watched it for a minute or so, before collectively agreeing to not tell any of the staff, as to not risk any more restrictions. We soon had dinner, and afterwards, Sam pulled me aside and said he wanted to wrestle the crocodile into submission in order to impress Jasmine. We were still very early in high school and only 14, so for a boy his age to have such ideas, while stupid, wasn't unheard of. Even though I was the same age, by that point I knew better, and I called him an idiot. He called me a wimp. I told him Jasmine would think he was stupid, but he insisted that she wouldn't, and so on. We went back and forth for a bit, but neither of us budged on our positions, and our conversation died by the time it was time for lessons. He didn't bring it up the following day while at breakfast or volunteering, so I figured he must have either changed his mind or simply forgot. It wasn't until the bus brought us back to the mansion did I lose track of Sam. I found him by the swamp with Jasmine, and he was letting her fish with his gear. I went over to join them, and for a few minutes, nothing happened, until Jasmine mentioned spotting the crocodile again. It was swimming to the left of us. That is when Sam brought up his bold idea of wrestling the crocodile once more. Jasmine just laughed, not taking him very seriously at first, but then he began to follow the crocodile down its path. I once again tried to convince Sam that he was an idiot, and both Jasmine and I chased after him. We were beginning to stray pretty far from the property, to the point that we had to make our way through some wild, unkempt forestry. I knew that if we were gone too long, we could get into serious trouble. Sam stopped to pick something off the ground, and by the time we caught up to him, he'd thrown it into the water. It missed the crocodile, but seemed to get its attention. Both Jasmine and I were begging him to knock it off. He picked up a stick and told us to take it easy and threw it. I tried to stop him, but couldn't block it in time. This time, it did hit the crocodile. Its head poked from the water, and it hissed at us. I screamed to Sam that he pissed it off and we needed to leave. But before any of us knew it, it descended from the water in a completely upright manner. The swamp couldn't have been more than a few feet deep, and we could see the upper half of this thing's body. It had a toned humanoid shape, despite being covered in dark green scales. It began to trudge through the marsh, hissing all the while. I caught glimpses of its lower arms, which seemed nearly long enough to go down to its knees, as they would on a person. Like I said, I don't have great vision, but its hands looked to be very similar to the shape of a person's, except they had long, black nails on the ends of them, nearly qualifying as claws. We screamed and ran off, trying to make our way through the shrubbery in order to get back onto the property. We yelled, warning everybody outside about the nearby monster, and most people just looked at us in confusion. Past the forestry, it let out another hiss. Some heard it, and others did not, causing only more confusion. One of the adults nearby ushered us inside, and after a couple of minutes of gathering everybody, they began counting heads. Once it was confirmed we were all inside, Sam, Jasmine, and I began to get questioned about what we saw. We repeated what we had already said. Most people had their own opinions and comments on the matter, but they were shushed. The adults didn't know what to think. They weren't sure if we were just pulling the prank. We stressed that we weren't. One of them pointed out that regardless of our specific story, a part of it wasn't true. She did hear the hiss of a crocodile in the nearby marsh, meaning that there was definitely one out there. One of the more superstitious, older staff members did believe us, and presumed that the crocodile was an evil spirit. They debated calling the police, and at this point, many students were demanding to have their phones so they could call their parents. I knew it was going to be a long night, so I just laid in my bed upstairs. We ended up being kept inside the rest of the day, and it had an hour-long prayer session solely dedicated to banishing the spirit, cutting into half of our lesson time. I couldn't tell which I'd rather do, if I'm being honest. I was still making sense of the creature myself, and trying to come to a conclusion of what exactly I saw. The next morning, I woke up to some ruckus going on downstairs. Apparently, while checking out the area at dawn to make sure it was safe, one of the staff members saw the crocodile in the distance. She said it stood at about 7 to 8 feet tall. Its body looked like a malformed person's, with its bones jutting out at strange angles. As the day went on, we skipped going to volunteer as the adults figured out what to do. They ended up letting us have our cell phones back and called the landowner in a nearby hotel to try and move us instead. Around evening, we were all ushered into the bus and driven off to a hotel about 30 miles away. Once we got there, some parents had driven down to pick up their kids, Jasmine's parents included, but otherwise the mission trip was going to resume as usual once we all got settled in. I gave Sam some crap about how he had ruined both the mission trip and his own chance to get with Jasmine, but I figured that the incident alone was enough of a lesson for him not to mess with wild animals. The rest of the trip resumed as normal, although the crocodile was basically the main talk amongst us kids the entire time. Because one of the staff members saw the monster for herself, most of the adults had believed it was some sort of demonic entity by that point. So, we were often shushed and even punished if we were caught discussing the thing. Some kids had their phones taken away for the rest of the trip as well, and some would have detention upon returning to school. The staff were worried we'd attract its attention and potentially even risk it following us back to Georgia. Of course, being forbidden from chatting about it made us want to talk about it even more. Now, it's been a long time since this event, and I've had a lot of time to sit on my thoughts regarding the whole matter. These days, I don't consider myself as deeply religious or conservative as the way I was raised, but I still am a Christian and am active in my local church and community. I have told my story to many people within its sense, and while some believe it was some sort of demon, most seem to figure it was simply a bizarre living creature that's from this earth. That's the conclusion I've come to as well. I've been down to Florida many times since then, a few times not even being too far off from the location of said mansion. I have never seen anything like it since. I mean, not that I particularly wish to. So, I'm a van dweller. If that's not self-explainable enough, it's basically when somebody willingly lives in a van rather than a house or apartment. It's not too bad. My van is equipped with basically everything a regular house would have. It's just in a more compact space, and ultimately, it is cheaper in the long run. If I need a shower, I can stop by the gym. If I needed to use the bathroom, I will either use the closest gas station or the great outdoors. In recent years, it has become pretty trendy to van dwell, and that is no surprise given the ridiculously housing and rent prices these days. Listen, I'm not here to sound like a hipster, but I have been at this gig for nearly 2 decades now, so I'd argue I've got a lot more experience than most people do on the road, good and bad. I've had people try to steal my van, or steal things from inside my van. Sometimes, they've tried to steal my van while I'm still inside of it. I've had weirdos follow me for miles, meth heads breaking in my windows, cops pulling me over for thinking I'm hauling immigrants, and so forth. If you and I met at a bar, I could keep you occupied all night with all kinds of crazy tales from my life on the road. At the same time, I have met many wonderful people throughout all sorts of cultures in both American continents, and have seen countless beautiful sights, whether they are cities with skyscraper towers or open ranges where the population is sparse. I have gotten to try so many kinds of foods and hear all kinds of music and listen to unique stories and perspectives on life. Van life isn't perfect, and it's definitely hard work, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'll die knowing I've lived my life to the fullest, and that's all I could really ask for. Still, none of my experiences, good or bad, compare to the surrealness of when I was lurking in the mountains of Montana about 10 years ago. I had been traveling around the northwestern U.S. for a couple of months and was preparing to drive back down south as fall was getting ready to make its return. It was a night in around early September, I'd say, and I found myself inside an aloof campsite somewhere in the western part of the state. Whenever I could, I slept in a brightly lit, busy area. Sounds like hell, but curtains over the windows along with earplugs make it so it's really not that bad. I did this for safety reasons, obviously. Less chance of somebody trying to steal my stuff. Being in the western half of the US, though, I had to get used to the idea that I wouldn't always find a place like that, given how spread out its geography is. A lot of nights in my van and I were completely alone in wide, empty areas. I had trouble sleeping through the first few nights because of it, but I grew accustomed to it, eventually. I even left the curtains open so I could see the stars through my window. The lack of light pollution was quite a nice change of pace, and I began to dread having to sleep in cities again. On this particular night, I had begun a fire and cracked open a beer, playing on a banjo that I had gotten just a few months prior. The cell service and internet was shoddy where I was at best, and at the time, I hadn't yet gone out of my way to get a mobile plan, which involved usage of satellites, so I wasn't left with much to entertain myself with except my banjo and a few books. I stopped playing as soon as my eye caught sight of an animal lurking somewhere in the distance. The fire provided enough light to make out a figure of what appeared to be an elk, but there was something extremely strange about its appearance. It seemed to be discolored. Its legs were abnormally long, and it looked like it had too many joints. When I squinted my eyes to get a better look at it, my heart began racing as I noticed its face was only a skull. The rest of its body was covered in fur, but past its neck, it was just bone. No skin, eyes, no anything. I was trying to make sense of it in my head, but no matter how I tried to come to a conclusion, I always thought of another way that it couldn't be explained. And that's when I noticed it didn't have any hooves, but what seemed to be human hands on both the end of its front and back legs. Even though it didn't visibly have any eyes, it seemed to stare at me. It didn't move, however. Not wanting to move myself, I simply froze. I couldn't do much but try and calm myself down by focusing on the chirps of the bugs that surrounded me and the thing. And after what felt like forever, which was probably actually only a minute, I began to slowly play my banjo again. I don't know why I did this, if I'm being honest. It didn't react. I continued this for a bit until I ultimately decided to get up from the log I'd been sitting on and walk backwards into my van, silently closing the doors and shut the curtains, all the while making sure to keep the interior dark. I was tempted to climb into the driver's seat and take off, but at the same time, I didn't want to cause any disturbances. I wasn't sure whether or not it was a hostile creature. It was just standing there and staring. I didn't want to alarm it and cause it to lash out and damage my van, especially in the middle of nowhere. I crawled in bed instead and tried to sleep. After a few minutes, I heard what sounded like the snort of a horse, and I heard something shifting around my van. The fire outside was still lit, and through the curtains, I could make out the silhouette of the elk mere feet away from me. It continued to pace around, and it seemed to do this for hours. Somehow, I fell asleep, and by the time morning came, I pulled back the curtains to check to see if it was still there. I couldn't find anything. The fire had put itself out and was still smoking, and I decided it was still safe to head out and take a leak. As soon as I opened my car door, I noticed a pile of sticks right in front of it. I was confused, but I figured I must have not noticed them sitting there in the evening before. I had to go to the bathroom pretty bad, so I ignored it and did my business. Then went about my day. I was on my way down south, and when I stopped again that night, I noticed I was still in Montana, but pretty far from the campsite I'd stayed the night before. I slept in the parking lot and woke up the next morning to what I swore was the same pile of sticks just outside my van, except this time, it was slightly less in quantity. Again, I ignored it and continued on my travels. When I took a nap in northern Wyoming, I still woke up to the sticks, and yet again, in an even smaller pile. I was freaked out as anybody would be. Part of me was tempted to take the sticks and lock them in my car, so whoever or whatever was messing with me would have to go out of their way to bother me. Still, at the same time, I did not think it was a good idea to touch the things, and at that rate, they'd disappear soon enough anyway. It wasn't until I'd gotten towards the middle half of Wyoming did the sticks finally stop showing up. For the rest of that year, I had no problems. I told my family and friends of the strange incident, but they treated my sighting as nothing more than an urban legend, and the stick incident as a mere coincidence. If I'm being honest, so did I. I figured I was just seeing things, that maybe it was something about the high altitudes that threw my brain and vision off. The following summer, I traveled back up to the northwest and stopped about 50 miles from the campsite where I first saw the elk. My heart sank when I woke up the following morning to another pile of sticks right outside my van. I swore it was even smaller than the last time. My paranoia then got the best of me, so I decided to say screw my plans and leave then and there, going off to sleep when I only had to. When I did rest that night, I found 2 sticks crossed over each other, like an X, the following morning. When I drove even further, I woke up to none at all. When I saw more of my friends about a month later, one of them said her aunt was a psychic and could probably tell me what was going on. I didn't really believe in paranormal stuff, but with what I had experienced, I was open to any sort of input. She got me on the phone with her aunt, and her aunt said that while she wasn't absolutely certain, she believed I did something to disturb a skinwalker on what it considered its sacred grounds, and used these sticks as a warning to get me to get out and stay far away, and that the longer I lingered, the less chances I had. What it ended up doing to me, though, was only left to the imagination. She said I was good to get out of there when I did, because who knows what would have ended up happening the next night. It wasn't long before the idea that my banjo music appalled the skinwalkers so much that it threatened to kill me made its way around my friend group as an inside joke. I laughed along with them, but deep down, I was and still am terrified. I have not returned to the area since, and will never go back, because I know it will remember me. Hell, at this point, I basically refuse to touch any state that borders Montana. I am a bit disappointed, given how beautiful the Mountain West is. If this never happened, I would probably spend most of my summers up there. I do sometimes wonder if I could cheat in the sense of visiting Alberta or Saskatchewan instead. But something tells me skinwalkers don't abide by modern concepts of borders. To me, it's just not worth the risk, or putting my family through the trouble of needing my body transported from Canada to the U.S., or having to deal with me being missing entirely from a different country. Whatever the case, I'm glad I've stayed far away to not bother it anymore. I don't even want to think about what might have happened to any other potential people out there that didn't listen to the warnings it's given them. Maybe I'm a little too paranoid, or carried away because of my experience, but I can't help but wonder if that's why so many people go missing in the mountains, only to never turn up again. I'm an amateur filmmaker, and it just so happened that me and my crew found ourselves wandering the Bible Belt, looking for a place to shoot our next film, a bit of a Halloween special. For most indie movie makers, that wouldn't be a problem, but the deal breaker was the kind of films we shot. Even if I tried to lie about what we were going to do, it was pretty obvious by the way I dressed, and especially by the way my actress was dressed, that we didn't exactly share the local values regarding entertainment. So, people would often, very often actually, refuse to have anything to do with us. So, we kept tooling down the road, looking for an old abandoned farmhouse or barn or grain bin, anything that looked rural and spooky and vacated so that my actors wouldn't be interrupted when the action was in full spring. When we spotted a place, we inquired at the most relevant looking home. More than once, we had people not only tell us we weren't welcome, but they pulled a shotgun from somewhere near the door, so hung up on the sins of my crew that they forgot that murder was just as bad. Despite my reputation on the other side of the camera, I know when to pull out, so we just kept moving on, instead of trying to negotiate. We were running out of daylight and gas money, and none of these fine, firearm-toting believers were going to let us use their property for a little Halloween special. I was awfully close to just being done with asking, and taking the risk of storming an empty place, and damn the consequences if we got caught. The very last house we decided to visit, we raised an old woman, shaped like a wood stove, who wore a cross so big that I thought it might have been the reason her back was hunched. There were crosses on her porch, over the door frame, and we could see inside her house and see a ton more crosses. I wondered if there was a local vampire problem or something. She wasn't going to let us use her skeletal old barn, but she was quick to direct us to a place down the road. There would be an exit off to the right that we would miss if we weren't looking for it. I was skeptical and wondered if she was sending us to one of those places where the whole neighborhood becomes a shooting range when strangers set foot in the place. But the sun would be setting soon, and the people I answered to were blowing up my phone about making sure we meet every deadline. We almost missed the exit. It wasn't so much an exit as it was a hole in the trees that hugged the side of the road. If the main drag was a vein, then this spit off a path that was a little more than a capillary, and our van just barely fit through it. It was a paved path, broken up into rubble by weeds that were very well established. This road hadn't been maintained for a very, very long time. Just like that, we were spit out into a neighborhood that was clustered tightly with houses. It looked like any average place where basketball hoops hung off some garages, and swing sets stood in a few yards, and cars were parked off the sides of the streets. Except everything was still and quiet. It felt like the streets were holding their breath for some sign of normalcy. A dog barking, one of the cars pulling out into the road, the sound of a basketball smacking the pavement. But there was really nothing. The silence felt wrong despite all the signs of abandonment. Paint peeled off of everything. Broken windows had trees punching through them from the inside. Some of the cars should have crumbled to a pile of rusty ashes with the breeze. And the grass, and every single yard was tall, sprouting seed heads and wildflowers. If there had been anyone here to ask permission for filming, we missed them by decades. My actress now was visibly weirded out by the emptiness, but me and my guy were thrilled with the idea of having an entire community to ourselves. This meant we had an insane variety of sets to choose from. I was considering driving by all of them, but I knew which one we wanted as soon as I saw it. The cracked roads wound their way up to the gentle slope of a hill, where, overlooking everything, sat a 3-story house that must have been a mansion in its day. Everything about it screamed haunted. We had found our set. Our actress was huddled in her seat, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. It felt that I had weird vibes, but I was thinking about how authentic our set was going to be, and they can make all the noise they wanted to, with nobody for miles to hear us. It took us a minute to navigate past a badly parked car here and there, and other derelict objects. It almost looked as if everybody had left in a hurry. So if the rest of the neighborhood was run down and dilapidated, the house highest on the hill was the worst. I questioned exactly how safe it would be to film there, if we were all going to fall to the floor in the middle of everything. But my love for cash outweighed my fear for the safety of my crew. Shame on me. But in this industry, you don't hire people for any special talent on their part. Good looks are a dime a dozen. So, we started to really scope the place. I brought in electric lamps, and my guy actor was eager to have a look around, and using the light off his cell phone. There was a thick odor of wet dog in the air, and a faint smell of death and blood. It was a bit unsettling, but we didn't let it get to us. My man actor was just a little too fearless of using the stairs. They didn't just creak, they cracked. I could hear them. It sounded like an old man's hips breaking with each step. But onward he went, like I said. I didn't hire him for his brains. My actress, who usually doesn't get close to him until she absolutely has to, was clinging to him for dear life. I felt a little insulted, 'cause I'm their paycheck. At least with him, what they do together on camera is honest. Anyone that becomes an actor in this field is automatically sketchy on some level. But when you direct like I do, then you're 10 times sketchier. I began moving all of our stuff in one piece at a time. Coolers, supplies, extra clothing. It was the early fall after all, and it was already much cooler than usual. I dropped the trunk I was carrying when I heard screams from upstairs. I didn't move as quickly as a properly concerned human being should have, but hey, those rickety steps. I found my people in what must have been a nursery. Moldy and mossy stuffed animals lined the walls like mummies on an underbroken shelf. The cause of the commotion was in a crib that time had gnawed into a nest of splinters, and what was left of the mattress was stained with more than just water and dirt. A rusty brown had permeated the frayed fabric in such a way to suggest that violence had visited a room a very, very long time ago. All this time, that was what we found the perfect place for our Halloween special. My guy was fascinated. My gal was pretty shaken up, and she was gibbering like a frightened rabbit. I let her know in not so subtle terms that we were filming here, and she was going to have to get used to it. The peach light of the sunset started to stream in through the boards of the walls. It was intense, and created a special aesthetic that I was totally stoked over. So I told my lovebirds to get busy while the light lasted. The camera had been rolling for about 5 minutes when there was a crash downstairs, followed by another, and another. One of them was definitely our food cooler, spilling its contents, including many bottles of beer. My first thought was that we were either being robbed or being evicted by the moral majority. I realized real soon that no people were involved when I heard and felt a purring rumble make the floorboards tremble beneath my feet. A throaty bass that shook nerves and surrounding inanimate objects alike. The moldy dolls and teddy bears shuddered, as if they shared a collective giggle over a joke that we weren't in on. That's when it was time for me to get out my little girl, a .22 I packed on me at all times. And in this line of work, there are predators on and off camera, and you gotta show them you're serious. My actress was shivering so bad, I thought she might fall through the floorboards under us, and whatever was downstairs by falling through, well, we'd see it. I waved to both of them to be quiet. As soon as I set foot on the screaming staircase, there was a sharp, roaring bark from somewhere down there, along under the breaking wood. My view lowered with the steps just in time to see a cloud of dust swirling around a hole punched into one of the walls that hadn't been there when we came in. That same purring rasp came rhythmically from the hole, like a ragged breathing. I held my gun with one hand and lit up my phone in the other. LED light scrubbing pale blue over a room full of pink sunlight. The rays of the sun were deepening to red, and they outlined the hole, showing little else. The ghost light of my phone showed me something that the sunlight didn't. Fur. There was a cloud of fur mingling with the swirling dust. I shone my light into the hole, expecting the shape of a bear. I nearly pissed myself when an empty beer bottle sailed out of the hole, glinting in my phone light and shattering against the wall behind me, followed by a deep bass grunt, rattling my entire ribcage. And then, as if I should have seen them all along, there were 2 points of light, the color of honey deep in the hole. Like hell had yawned open, and a demon was going to take the opportunity to escape. It took my phone several seconds to hit it with the light. I saw it for just a split second, so tall that it had to hunch a little for the ceiling. Mangy black fur like Spanish moss, and a horrifying odor of wet dog and blood. The muzzle curled up, showing long teeth like lost souls shaped into icicles. The fur around the chin dripping something wet, with either saliva or something else. I raised my gun and fired, bathing the thing in flashes of light, the same color as its eyes. The cry this got me told me I was killing its buzz. One flash was a snapshot of pointed ears drawn back in primal rage, and teeth bared down to the gums, coming straight for me. That was also the flash where I saw a mist of fluid splash around one of its eyes. I must have hit it, because it sailed to the wall to the outside, rending the wood like it was straw. A distant and pained roar rolled through the new hole in the wall. Then, the only sounds were coming through were the panic of the crew upstairs. Safe to say we didn't finish filming. We hauled out of there, double time. I sent off an explanation to my higher-ups that I knew they wouldn't believe. But with that much adrenaline in my system, let's just say I wasn't in the mood to lose more than my beer and one film's pay. Whatever that was that we ran into, I have no idea. I normally don't believe in things that go bump in the night, but I encountered something that certainly wasn't human. When I was around 11 years old or so, my family was invited out to my second cousin's wedding down in Texas. She was marrying the nephew of an extremely high-ranking employee of a massive oil company. Just to be careful, and for the sake of everybody's privacy, I won't name which one. Also, I'm not sure how much I can disclose without potentially getting into legal trouble. But, basically, the entire family is very, very wealthy. I'm talking like the 1% kind of wealthy. While my cousin didn't come from a particularly rich background herself, she was incredibly smart, was the valedictorian of her class, and had gotten a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she met her to-be husband. Their wedding was going to be absolutely massive, and as far as I knew, had no budget. The invitation to the ceremony even told us to expect the time of our lives and to skip Disneyland this year. The actual wedding ceremony would only take place on one day, but the festivities were over the course of a week, and we were told to treat it no different than a vacation. My immediate family was all the way up in Pennsylvania, and we were provided with the money from the groom's family to buy top-quality suits and dresses for the event, and were even given free first-class tickets for our flight to Texas. It was a nice gesture, but it was pocket change for them, really, and I'm sure they wanted everybody to look as good as possible. Regardless, living a mundane suburban middle-class life family made my family excited for the occasion. It would be quite the change of pace from what we were used to. We arrived just a few days before the wedding, so we could get settled in. My immediate family was provided with our own cottage to stay in, as were all of the other guests. The land in which the house was sited on was several hundred acres, large, filled with forestry. It even included a secluded little village with charming shops and restaurants. To top it all of this was bordered by a massive lake. I spent most of my first day there, walking around or being hauled around in golf carts with my family. I reunited with the relatives that I hadn't seen in a while and met my to-be in-laws. Most of them were polite enough, but our extremely stark differences in class did make things feel awkward. That evening during dinner, I was invited by a member of the groom's family to have a kids' sleepover on one of the yachts the following evening. My parents were a bit hesitant to let me go, but ultimately agreed when our in-laws reassured them that they would all be well supervised, and the boat was equipped with many security cameras. So, if one of the kids went missing, it'd be pretty easy to track down where they went. I was mostly excited to have the opportunity to actually hang out with other kids my age. The next morning after breakfast, I was boarding the boat, as they planned to have us go fishing that afternoon. It was absolutely massive. I swore it was nearly as long as a football field. We were told that if we really wanted to, we could each have our own bedroom, and I'd say there were about 30 of us on board. After they made sure everybody was on the boat, we waved off to our parents and relatives as it began to churn forward. I remember holding onto the railings and watched the water below. After about 15 minutes, we had arrived at the spot that we would be fishing in. We were taken to an area of the boat that was solely dedicated to fishing, and were provided with our fishing rods and bait. We had fun and caught a lot of things. We kept the fish in a cooler, so the cooking staff that were brought along with us could prepare dinner. I spent a lot of the day exploring the boat. I mean, it had everything. It had its own arcade, bowling alley, aquarium, pretty much anything cool and fun you can think of. We were given fancy snacks and candy I'd never even heard of before. And when it was time for dinner, we had an all-you-can-eat buffet with such a wide array of foods that I didn't even know where to begin. I was absolutely stuffed by the end of the hour. Most of the kids decided to wind down in the yacht's movie theater, so I tagged along. I actually found the rich kids to be a bit annoying and stuck up, but I was having a good time with my cousins, and that was all that mattered. I knew it would be an occasion we'd be talking at family reunions for years, perhaps even decades to come, and I wanted to make the most out of it. We put on our first movie, Jaws. The age range of kids was about 8 to 13, and the adults on the boat promised to not tell our parents that we viewed the film, and that they were cool. After a couple of hours, everybody seemed to settle down to sleep. I nodded off, but awoke to the feeling of a bang, followed by a harsh rocking of the boat. Not surprisingly, this tore the other kids out of their sleep too. They began to ask what was going on, and the younger ones cried about how it was Jaws. After a couple of minutes, it happened again, perhaps even more forceful this time. Some kids were screaming at this point, and I was trying to figure out what in the lake could even be big enough to make the yacht rock with such a force. The lights flicked on, and I squinted as my eyes adjusted to the brightness. One of the adults was here by now, and was urging us to calm down. Some kids left the room, and I was curious to see what was going on, so I went along with them. We were yelled at to stay in the room, but didn't listen. I looked over the railing and saw splashing from beside the boat, and then heard a loud echoing groan, like that of a whale's. Some speculated it was a whale, but others reminded them that whales don't live in fresh water. The boat was still slightly rocking from the force of whatever was moving around it, and I had to hold onto the railing just to keep my balance. In the light that the yacht provided, I swore I can make out what looked to be part of a massive fin peek out from above the water before disappearing back underneath. After a couple of minutes and talking among the other kids, I noticed the silhouette of a serpent far in the distance, with the humps of its body sticking out from the lake in a parabola-like manner. Its head looked to be similar to what you'd expect to see on a lizard. The serpent went back under the surface, and all was quiet. We stayed up for about an hour or so after, waiting for its return, but it never came back. We finally went to bed, all of us exhausted the following morning. We were still pretty excited by the event though, and it was all we talked about. Some kids even called and texted their parents about it. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, but I was anxious to tell my parents. By the time we returned to the docks, it was nearly time for lunch, and that's when I caught up with my family and told them what had happened. They seemed mostly confused but glad I was okay. Later on in the evening, I found out the groom's family had called out a crew to inspect the yacht to make sure it wasn't damaged. They were told that the underbelly had quite a few hefty dents and that they were lucky that a hole wasn't pierced. There was some drama among the family, mostly on them debating whether or not the incident was some crude assassination attempt or possibly a terrorist attack. I heard staff were fired for not reporting the incident right away, or returning the boat back to the docks that night. It was a mess. There was already a lot of security at that wedding, and it only doubled down. Now, I'm not entirely sure what happened next, but word had gotten out the next day that there was a wreckage of a small fishing boat and was found dispersed throughout the lake. From what was left of it, the authorities can make out that this belonged to a man who had been missing since the night we were out on the water. His body was nowhere to be found. It was quickly believed that there was some sort of bombs or other artillery in the water, but us kids who had been there that night knew differently. Most of us pieced together that the monster must have destroyed the man's boat before he was eaten. When we tried to relay the theory to the older folks, we weren't met with a lot of positive reception. I received a few scoldings about needing to respect the dead and consider how his family must feel, and that I needed to take the threat of a terrorist attack more seriously, as only a handful of years have passed since 9/11. At the same time, all of the guests were encouraged to keep as quiet as possible, as to not attract the attention of media and potentially ruining the wedding. Despite all of this, the wedding proceeded as normal and went smoothly. Towards the end, the trip was as fun and eventful as it was. When I was finally back home, I had the chance to tell my friends about it, and one of my friends said that his grandpa saw the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland before he immigrated to the U.S., and hypothesized that it was a species of dinosaur that never actually went extinct, as the water helped create a protective barrier between them and the meteor that struck the Earth. Whatever the case, I know what I saw, and I still stand by it after all of these years. As far as I'm aware, the man's body was never discovered, and he still remains missing to this day. I don't exactly spend a lot of time too invested in trying to find more evidence, and I'm not exactly a Nessie fanatic. Still, I figured I might as well get my story out there. It'd be nice to hear if anybody else had a similar experience down here in Texas. I frequented a long stretch of road in the white sand dunes of New Mexico. I could have avoided this rural area altogether, but I can't help it. I'm an astronomy nut. You see the stars and the solar system in ways you never have before when you're out here in the desert, where the air is dry and the nights are clear. When it's a new moon or a waning moon, then the whole universe comes out to play, and there's so much you can see with the naked eye. The convenience store that I worked at was in the middle of nowhere, and my home was on the outskirts of a city where you couldn't see that much just because of the light pollution, even though you could see more than your average metropolitan area. You see, I worked with only one other person besides the owner, a full-blooded Navajo. We'll call him Jacob for the sake of the story. Jacob didn't say much outside of thanking customers. The rest of the time, he was rather stoic, speaking only of duty or necessity. After so many nights in a row, parking in the same place, I started to have some visitors during my sky-gazing sessions. They weren't entirely deer, and they weren't entirely antelope, and they weren't entirely buffalo. They looked like a conglomeration of several hoofed herbivores, and I had a hard time placing them. But sure enough, while I was leaning against my car, gazing up at the sky, I started to see their shapes coming over the dunes, and they would stand and stare at me. At first, 2 or 3 at a time, then 6. One night, it seemed like I was surrounded by nearly a dozen. They would get closer each night, but they never got too close. Soon enough, I was as fascinated by those unnameable beasts as I was by the sky. As long as I pulled over to stargaze, they would come out to see me. One day at the convenience store, Jacob had asked me if it were possible to give him a ride home. I was delighted for 2 reasons. 1, because I never really got to know the guy, and 2, I was hoping he might be able to help me identify my partners in astronomy. I told him what I'd like to do on the way home, and asked if he wouldn't mind a brief detour. He was fine with it, but he seemed really puzzled when I told him about the animals. He told me that the area that road cut through was especially inhospitable to deer, and nothing like them would be lingering very long, unless they wanted to die of exposure or starvation. Before we knew it, the hour was upon us, and we locked up, and he got in my passenger seat after I cleared the takeout boxes. I stopped at the usual spot, and I couldn't help but being a fanboy over the things that were appearing in the night sky. It was just a silver a waning crescent moon, so the celestial bodies had almost no competition and were radiant. But also, I was afraid that it might be too dark to see any visitors. Jacob had stayed in the car and was content to roll down his window. After a while, I thought I saw movement, like a shadow moving in the shadows over the dunes, black on black. I lit up my phone's LED, and sure enough, points of light were shining back at me in pairs. The moonlight began picking out the shapes of my unusual visitors. I looked back at Jacob, and I don't know if it was a tick of the light, but he looked pale, and his eyes were both wide open, and yet glazed and unfocused. His lower lip trembled, like he was trying to say something, but couldn't find the voice to bring them to life. He made a grunting sound that sounded like a language. When I asked him what he said, he just repeated to me, "Get in the car now." I was about to ask him how come, when I jumped at the sound of a strange sort of laughter that sent chills down my spine and transformed my world into a very hostile place. The hyena-ish laughter was coming from the deer-like creatures, as if they knew I had started to doubt that they were the source of the weird sound. One by one, they started standing on their hind legs, and a few of them knocking the hooves of their forelegs together, as if they were clapping or taunting me. I killed the light on my phone, and yet the eerie glow did not leave their eyes. It was when I started to get in the car that there was sudden movement in all directions. They had hit the ground with all fours and charged the car with lightning speed. The instant my door had latched, there was an enormous crash on the hood of my car. One of the deer had landed on the hood of my car and smushed its face against the windshield so that its lips and gums were spread out. It ran a long pale gray tongue along the glass that looked kind of like some parasitic worm. The teeth were not like what you'd expect from a herbivore, like a deer, but they were long and serrated. Call me crazy, but it looked reptilian, more like crocodile teeth than anything else. Something shone in the eyes of the creature, with its mouth wide open, and its lips and gums splayed all over my windshield. There was definitely malice, but there was also madness and an unsettling intelligence. Unlike in the movies, the car started up just fine, and I had no issues getting out there, other than the incoordination caused by my shaking hands. My car lurched back onto the middle of the road with just enough force to throw the creature off the hood. I know it was dark, and I know that my senses were electrified, but I know that I saw the fur of the thing shedding off and being replaced by something textured, like scales. Also, the headlights may or may not have quickly lit up the shape of a tail that was rigid, just like a crocodile's, or what resembled that. It was minutes before I felt like I could breathe again, and I managed to get Jacob home in one piece. Once I could finally form a whole sentence again, I asked him what I had just seen, what we had just seen. He waited so long to answer that I almost thought he didn't hear me. His reply merely was that the Navajo didn't discuss it with outsiders. At least that's what he said. I felt insulted. I mean, whatever had just happened, it happened to both of us. But no. He told me as politely as possible that since I wasn't Navajo, we shouldn't discuss it. And even the Navajo themselves didn't discuss it among themselves, if they could help it. I was too shaken up to argue, so I agreed that I would be giving him a ride to work tomorrow, and I went back to my own place to black out. The next day when I went to pick him up, he wasn't outside waiting for me, and I was already running behind. I went up to his door and knocked on it. No answer. I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw him standing in the window next to the door, staring at me with wide eyes. Kind of like he was staring at the night before when he saw the creatures standing on their hind legs. I yelled at him that it was time to go and he needed to hustle, but he didn't move. In fact, he didn't even answer. That's when I began to realize something was even more wrong than there was yesterday. After calling the police, I tried his door and it was unlocked. I invited myself in and tried to get through to Jacob. He wouldn't acknowledge me standing beside him. He continued staring out the window with his mouth open slightly. I found his cell phone and found his emergency contacts. He had a brother that didn't live too far away. So I called him and let him know that Jacob was in some kind of shock that he wouldn't come out of. Medics arrived and Jacob's brother came on their heels. He noticed something that I hadn't. Jacob was gripping something in one hand with blanched knuckles, some kind of artifact or talisman. I asked him what it was. He seemed to hesitate to answer. He proceeded to ask me if either he or I had been seeing anything unusual, and so I told him about the events that led up to last night. Then he acted like he didn't want to talk anymore. But once Jacob was loaded into the ambulance, he took me aside and spoke to me in extremely hushed tones, even though we were the only ones there at the moment. He asked me if I have ever heard anything called a skinwalker. Of course I hadn't, so he ran down the general idea and explained that not all skinwalkers are created equal. You've got the typical type that are bad enough, the medicine men that turn to practicing black magic. But then you have the ones that have been so corrupted, so thoroughly blackened from the inside out, that even in their natural state, they appeared beastly and corrupted, moving closer to the form of their father with each transformation, a serpent-like being. They lure their prey out into the desolate sands outside of civilization for their magic rituals and for food. And you better pray to God that you are the food if they get you. He went on to tell me that they aren't always content to tear apart your flesh. Sometimes they like to rend your soul as well. The hex for this is cast with prolonged eye contact. I reflected on how Jacob seemed locked into staring from where he sat in the car. Jacob never fully recovered. I mean, he got better, but he never got well. I checked in on him periodically because, hey, that's what the world needs, right? Decent people. Some clarity did come back into his eyes, and after a few months, he could function enough. He started drawing disability because he couldn't leave the house for very long, and it was attributed to mental illness. When I looked into Jacob's eyes, I could see the light hadn't just gone out. It had been taken. Anyway, I kept seeing those animals on the drive home, but only from a distance. Their eyes were like stars that had been thrown down to the earth. Once and only once did one of the creatures get close. I was driving well over 60 miles an hour, and I didn't slow down for 1 second, as long as I was on the road, let alone stop to look at the sky. Something had compelled me to look my left, and there was one of them, keeping pace with my car, and it looked like it was doing it with ease. It was looking right at me, and its lips were pulled back into a hideous grin. I began to feel lightheaded, and I forced my eyes to the road. I could see in my peripheral that it was licking my window. Then it ran off into the night. Again, I have no idea what these things are or where they came from, but I know now to try and be very aware of my surroundings. I haven't told anybody about this encounter ever, except one close friend of mine, who was surprisingly very receptive to what I had to say. This encounter happened back in 2003, right around February. This was in Tennessee, near Crab Orchard. At the time, I was doing a lot of hiking around and exploring. At the time, I was walking through a small patch of woods. Now, something people are not familiar with, or if they are not familiar with the Tennessee woods, is that we do have wild boar here, so you have to be careful. Sometimes they will charge you, and we also got bear. Not grizzlies or anything like that. Pretty much black bear, or at least that's all I've ever seen. But on this day, I saw something that I'm pretty sure wasn't natural by any means. In fact, part of me is convinced it was something evil, something out of hell. Whatever this was, walked out from the woods, started walking towards me. What freaked me out the most was obviously this thing looked like a demon, but it walked bipedal, on 2 legs. It didn't seem awkward or like it was having a hard time. This thing had the shape and body of a human, but it looked like a dog with large claws and the head of a wolf, covered in long, strangly gray and black hair. Whatever this thing was seemed to have its sights set right on me, and it was picking up its pace the closer it got. To give you a little bit more perspective, to my left was kind of a large hill. I'd say maybe an incline that went up about 75 feet. This thing appeared out of the woods at the top of that ridgeline, looked at me, and started coming down towards me. I panicked. I could feel this thing's energy radiating towards me, and it felt bad, very negative, like it was coming to hurt me. It never took its eyes off me the entire time it made its way down the ridgeline. Now, I know a thing with predators or two. The last thing you ever want to do is turn and run. So I kept my pace and I slowly moved backwards as far as I could to where I can get to a point so that I could finally turn and run without fear of this thing pursuing me to kill me. And then, out of nowhere, like in some sort of freak Hollywood movie, this thing dramatically picks up its pace and starts sprinting towards me, gaining speed and momentum on me like I was some injured mouse being chased by a starving cat. I was so terrified, I peed my pants right there and was able to jump and hide behind a thick tree while this, what I can only describe as a monster, came in my direction. Because of the brush, it must have not saw me as I dove behind this tree, because as it kept pursuing me, it started to go in a different direction, where it looked like I had gone. It stopped and began sniffing around, only a mere 20 or so feet away from me, and began low growling, this low guttural terrifying growl, as if it was hungry and searching for me. I don't know what this thing's intent was, but I nearly cried, and I'm a grown man. I've been through lots of sketchy situations out in the woods, even been chased by a mama bear and her cubs before, and even then, I'd never been this scared in my life. I think it was partially because this thing looked right out of a horror movie, like it was a demon, something completely unnatural and looked like it was designed to kill, torture, and maim. After a few moments, this thing moved on, but I could still hear it rustling around in the brush very close by. I have no idea why it didn't smell me or know I was there. Or maybe it did. I don't know. Had this thing caught up to me in time, and had I not jumped behind that tree, there's no telling what this thing would have done to me, especially considering if I would have fallen and injured my ankle or my knee, or worse, broke something. I would have been a goner, and probably not been able to live to tell this story. Even though this happened a long time ago, nearly 20 years ago, I still have frequent nightmares about this same creature. Although I've been out in the woods many times since, hunting, hanging out with friends, fishing, camping, sightseeing, you name it. I've never felt that same innate feeling of fear or encountered anything quite like what I did then. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I can't dismiss that at all. I will say the things it was not. It was definitely not a wild bear, nor was it a wild boar. None of those animals stand up on two legs, look like wolves, and tower over me. I mean, this thing looked very unique. There's no mistaking the identity of whatever monster this was. All I can say is that even now, afterwards, I'm very careful about where I go, who's around me, the weapons I carry, and my awareness. The problem, I think, is that a lot of these guys who are expert hunters or spend a lot of time in the outdoors just get overly cocky, and so their self-sense of awareness seems to go down, or their care or lack of. Anyway, I'm not here to spread false narratives. This is something that really happened to me, and has really left an indent on my life. Like I told you, it's affected the way I go back into the woods, the way I look behind my back when I hear a noise, the way I respond to animals around me, the people I bring with me, and the weapons that I keep on me or around me. I will never go into the woods again unarmed, or at least not prepared to encounter this thing again. Now, I haven't seen this thing again like I told you already, but there's no telling that in my future it won't come again for me. Who knows? Even though I wasn't born and raised in the Great Lakes area, although having lived in Indiana for a while, I've kind of caught on to some things around the area. The Ohio grassman, which is very commonly talked about. Well, what I heard this day, or what I should say experienced, was something other than the grassman. I don't exactly know what this could have been. It was very canine-like from what I experienced. Let me go ahead and get into this so you can understand. This happened a few years ago, but I will never forget it. The Spurgeon Hollow Trail is located directly in the middle of the Washington-Jackson State Forest. It is reached from a county road just a few miles off of State Highway 135. The trail itself is beautiful and thick with lush, gorgeous forest. At some point in the trail, it forks off, where if you take the left, it goes up a very steep incline, full of thick woods. If you take the right, it parallels the lake to your right side. Because I'm sadistic, in a way, and like to really burn my thighs, I went to the left, going up a very steep and thickly wooded hill area. Now, I want to point out that this is when the weird feelings began. Not even that far up the trail, I began to feel like I was being closely watched, and then, not too long after, started hearing some low growls. That's when I got another strange sensation that something was closing in on me. It was like being surrounded by a pack of wolves, I guess, and they were all coming for me. But I kept looking around, over my shoulder, in front of me, behind me, and to the sides of me. Nothing. One thing I recognized, though, was that the woods were very quiet. Very unusually quiet, that is. And there were no other hikers on the trail with me at the time. I don't know enough about this specific trailhead to tell you just how popular or how not popular this trail is. But I find it weird that at the time, I was the only one here. Anyway, I continued to push on, despite the ever-growing feelings of paranoia and that something was closing in on me. That's when I began hearing noises directly behind me, like something following me. I even thought I was being pranked, because every time I turned around, there would be nothing there. At one point, I considered that I was having hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, but I couldn't really pinpoint it on anything specific. Even though I had heard the low growls, the vegetation moving around me, and the snapping of twigs and trees, it was really hard for me to tell exactly what it was, but the feeling wouldn't shake. That is, until I got to one segment in the trail, where up ahead, I distinctly saw this, and there's no mistaking it. I will never forget it. About 6, maybe 7 feet up from the ground, I saw 3 heads pop out from behind different trees. They resembled wolf heads, or at least very similar to a canid type of animal, and they had these slow, glowing amber eyes. And when I say slow glowing, they almost kind of had this very low, slow pulsation going on. Like they would get brighter, and then they would dull, and then they would get brighter again, and dull. There was most definitely a pulsation going on, and it was almost sickly alluring, like some kind of alien light. It was terrifying, but again, alluring at the same time. It almost put you in a hypnotic trance, as if to lure yourself towards these creatures, whatever they were. I didn't see any pupils, but these eyes were very distinctive. And because I was there in the afternoon, there was plenty of daylight, so there was no mistaking that I was seeing this creature. And there wasn't just one. There was 3 of them, all standing behind a different tree that were all close to each other, watching me, watching my every step. I don't know if they purposely made themselves visible, or at least their heads, or what, but I strongly believe at the time that they decided to make themselves somewhat known, because these were the things that had been following me since the fork in the trail. I want you to know that at that moment, I felt 2 very distinct feelings. The first was this hypnotic trance, as if I was being lured towards them. It's a feeling I don't quite understand, nor can I accurately describe. It was a feeling out of my control, like my body was just responding, and I was being pulled effortlessly towards them, without any of my control. The second feeling was the worst feeling in the pit of my stomach. My entire being screaming that I needed to leave there now, that I needed to get out of there. Danger, danger. Somehow, I just managed to collect myself enough to escape and run as fast as I could, not caring if whatever these things were chased after me. Again, they were so high up in the trees that they were looking down from me, and they were behind the trees, so I couldn't see exactly what their bodies looked like. But I knew they were some sort of creatures, some sort of beings with wolf heads, and the heads were massive. It's hard for me to accurately describe to you, but that's what I experienced. It was horrifying, and it makes me not want to go back to certain trailheads because of it. That's my experience. Take it what you will, but that is what happened to me, and I have to be careful to this day where exactly I go, just to be sure that I don't run into those again. I saw something that I can't explain back in May of 2015. I was right around the Land Between the Lakes National Forest when I saw some sort of upright, biped walking wolfman. Whatever this thing that I saw looked exactly like something you would expect to see out of a horror movie. I mean, it was evil in the flesh, looking exactly like half man, half wolf, or dare I say, werewolf. Although I don't believe in the werewolf phenomenon. You know, people turning into a werewolf at the sight of a full moon. But I do believe in things that go bump in the night. It's also coincidental that in this area alone, there are tons of reports about a dog-like creature, as well as Bigfoot. Even though I don't believe I've seen either, but I believe this sighting that I've had, I do believe that I've seen this dog creature, whatever it's called. I think it goes by the name of Dogman, if I'm not mistaken. Whatever this creature was covered in thick, matted black hair, and had the head that perfectly resembled that of a very large wolf. One thing I noticed that seemed odd was just how large the head was. Like it didn't match the body size at all. It was so overly large. Like, had this thing not had its balance properly, its head would have caused it to tilt over and fall. That's just how big this thing was. It towered over my car, easily 8 feet I'd say. I mean it. This thing was huge. I was driving, probably somewhere around midnight. I can't exactly be sure on the time, but this thing runs right out of the road, onto the road, and looks right at me in the car. Then, it ran right back into the forest. I was stunned. It caused me to slam on my brakes since it ran so close to the car, from the opposite side of the road to the lane that I was in. It was just me in the car at the time, and the only weapon or anything to arm myself I had was a Swiss Army knife, which I knew wouldn't have done anything against this creature. What disturbed me the most was that I just knew deep down this wasn't some person trying to scare people or prank people in some costume. This looked too real, and nobody out here is going to be 8 feet tall, in a convincing werewolf costume, running around the woods, being able to move that fast, or have muscles that rippled through its fur. Right as soon as this creature left my sight and jumped into the woods, I was left with a sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I just wanted to open my car door and retch right there on the side of the road. As soon as it ran back into the woods, from the opposite side of the road that it originally appeared at, I could hear trees and branches breaking, like a bulldozer was bearing its way through the woods. Whatever this was had immense strength, and was definitely on a mission to get out of there, or to get somewhere. Even though at the time, I wasn't backpacking out into the backcountry, but I've been out to the bush multiple times, in all sorts of different situations. I've gone through some stuff, and I've seen things. For example, I nearly lost my leg when I accidentally stepped in a bear trap, but that's a story for another time. My point basically remains the same, is I've gone through some stuff, and I've never ever heard or seen anything like what I saw that night. It definitely left an impact on me, and has affected the way I treat the woods. I'm going to tell you a story back from when I was only 14 years old. This story has scared the living daylights out of me. It was so traumatic for me. It caused me to not go out for quite a long time. In fact, I even lost friends when I entered high school because of it. Most of the time, I was even too terrified to ride my bike to parties, or even to other friends' houses, because of this. That is, until I got to about 17, 18, and was able to get my license for the first time. Even then, I was tense being out by myself, but I felt safe under the illusion of a giant metal casing around me and glass. For about 5 years of my life, when I was around 9 years old to 14, I lived in a rural area in Mississippi. I didn't have much time to make a lot of friends, but I had a very small circle of very close friends. 3 of them, actually. And it was very common during the summertime for me to ride my bike to their houses. Because it was a rural area, everything was thickly wooded, with creeks, beautiful birds chirping, lots of bugs. You know how the South is if you live there. It's very humid in the summertime, but not enough to deter my 14-year-old self to go hang out with friends because, well, in 1978, when this occurred, there wasn't much to do other than maybe read books, throw a ball, and explore, which is what I try to do with my close buddies. So, to set the stage, this was the evening in the summertime. I want to say maybe it was a Saturday. I can't exactly remember. It's possible it was a school night. All I know is that I wasn't in school at the time. So, it was probably evening from what I remember. It all started with me riding my bike to my friend's house, who was closest to me. He lived about 3.5 miles away, down a long gravel road. Now, to set the geography a little better, between me and him was thick, thick woods. Sure, you could walk through it to get to his house, since if you did, our backyards were basically accessible from both sides of the woods, but it would take much longer, because the brush was very thick, and there was lots and lots of blackberry bramble, so good luck getting around that. 14-year-old me had no idea what was about to happen. Off to my right, somewhere on the road, I began hearing thrashing around, like a giant was thrashing and smacking trees and through brush. It sounded like a grizzly bear charging through the woods. It was enough to make me stop on my bike, turn and look. and although I heard the noise, I couldn't exactly see anything, until whatever this was bursted through the brush and the open trees, and started to chase after me. At first, I didn't know what it was. I just started screaming and pedaling as fast as I could. But as sadistic as whatever this animal was, it seemed to slow its pace as soon as it started chasing me. Like it could keep up with me easily, but it wanted to make sure to terrify me and just to cause fear. At least that's what I got out of it. And it did. It chased me for well over a mile before it jumped over a creek back into a different wooded area. After turning my head a few times to look at whatever this thing was, my pursuer, I was looking at a wolf creature, which later in my life, I would draw similar comparisons to the werewolves in the movie The Howling. But in 1978, those movies hadn't come out yet. That wouldn't be for another 5 to 10 years, and I wouldn't even see those movies till I was way in my later 20s. And when I did see them, oh boy, did that give me a rush back to memory lane and send me into a panic attack. And at the time, the girl I was living with, whom I was dating, didn't quite understand until I broke down and told her. I don't think she believed me. She had thought I was just having a manic episode and wanted to know if I needed to call an ambulance. But I tried to convince her. But again, I think she was more sympathetic than she was believing. It's the main reason why I don't tell many people my story. I've reached out to a few people who consider themselves cryptozoology reporters or YouTubers to get my story out there, because I think it's important for people who have trauma like I do to try and understand that we're not crazy, that we should be believed, and that this sort of thing does happen more often than not. Yes, I know sometimes it can be hard to believe, to think a creature like this truly exists and will chase you and attack you, but that's not exactly the case of reality. Even though this creature never did attack me, I feel had I stopped my bike and it got up to me, it would have probably torn me limb from limb, or so I can only imagine. Again though, this thing for whatever reason kept about an even 10 feet behind me, just enough to give chase and incite as much fear as possible, but not enough to get to me, and again darting off into the woods after a certain point. I mean, you gotta remember, at the time, I was only a 14-year-old kid. I could only pedal so fast. It's not like I had a mountain bike or anything exciting. It was a pretty cheap, dinky bike. I mean, it was more than enough to get around, but it wasn't exciting or expensive by any stretch of the means. I had no gauges in speed, and the only really way I can go faster was to obviously pedal faster, just like you had to in the old days, and that was that. As I try and sit here and dwell back on the memories of this thing chasing me and trying to remember what it looked like, if you've never seen the movie The Howling, just take your time and Google it, and you'll see kind of what I'm talking about. This wolf creature that I saw didn't look to the T of what those creatures looked like, but very, very close. The only main difference that I can really remember was the thing that I saw was built like a tank. I mean, it was rippling muscles, huge broad shoulders, and very, very strong. Enough that it burst through the thick brush like it did, with ease, and then it seemed to slow down when it started chasing me. I truly believe that it was more than strong enough and fast enough to catch up to me if it really wanted to. But why? Why was it so set on causing me fear and anxiety and wanting to chase me? It seemed like it was getting a thrill out of it, like it was enjoying causing me to be panicked. I'll never get it, and I don't think I'll quite understand exactly what it was that I saw. I ended up getting to my friend's house in probably only half the time that it originally would take me. I was pale as a sheet, terrified, shaking like a cold kitten left out in the cold. He didn't quite understand what had happened. I even had a hard time telling him what happened, but when I did, I think he just thought that I saw a large black bear, since there are black bears in Mississippi, and he thought potentially I maybe ran into a mama black bear with cubs around. But I stressed to him that black bears don't act like that, and they don't look like that. It didn't look anything like a black bear. Look at pictures of black bears, and then look at pictures of werewolves, and more specifically, the werewolves from The Howling. Now you tell me, do they look anything alike? I didn't think so, Even though the creature that chased me that day was more of a black color than it was a gray smoky color, it still again looked nothing that resembled a bear, especially in the face. In fact, I want to say it was even larger than a black bear. Either way, I still don't have the answers, and even now, talking about it can sometimes make me uncomfortable. But I know it's for the greater good, and I know that many people, if anybody listens to this, it will help them cope and maybe come out with their own story. This is something that I've kept to myself for a very long time, but I'm a fan of scary stories, and through the rabbit hole, stumbled upon your channel, which I then fell into the whole Dogman Encounters playlist you have, which has hours upon hours of these sightings of these creatures. Well, after listening to so many accounts, I feel that now's the right time to come forward with my sighting. I don't know if what I saw is exactly a Dogman, as described in every story that you have, but I believe that it was a Wolfman of some kind, because it closely resembled some of the descriptions that are in some of your stories. But first, I'll give you some appropriate background information on me. I go by Richie, and I'm about 41 years old, about to turn 42. I weld professionally for a company whose name I will keep anonymous for the sake of this being attached to them in any way, just in case this happens to go viral, because in the day of the internet, you really never know anymore. I'm a very serious individual, and I only believe what you can see and what is proven to be real. And what's more proof than seeing it with your own eyes? Especially this sighting that I had. So, enough about me. Let me tell you exactly what I saw. At this time, it was about 9:30, maybe 9:20. It was already dark out, so it was earlier in the year. By the way, this was in 2010. So, I'm driving on the 78, south of Blythe, California. There's really no other cars on the road. I mean, there are, but they're far and few in between. I think there was one behind me, maybe about half a mile, but that's not really relevant or really important to the story. What is important is that the only other vehicle I saw at the time in the oncoming lane was a large semi. Now here's where things get crazy. So there's no other car in front of me, and if you know anything about the 78, is that you're surrounded by desert, since you're right near Mexico, and this is the part of California that is hotter than hot can get. On average, it's about 90 to 100 degrees. Maybe not all year round, but it seems like a lot of it. I remember that I was just driving casually. I think I even had the radio on low, just doing my thing, watching the road. It was dark out, but enough light from my headlights and the oncoming semi with its back reflectors that I could easily make out it was an oncoming semi. But then, as I'm going 60, or whatever the speed limit was, I see this semi-truck halt on its brake and come to a screeching halt. Then, as my headlights start to hit it, I see what I can only describe to you, appropriately, as a Wolfman jumping up onto the hood of the semi, and then onto the back trailer, and then jumping off the back, and then out into the desert. It nearly caused the semi to crash off the road, and skid on its brakes, turning its trailer, nearly turning over entirely. I drove by slowly, my mouth agape, in total awe at what I just saw. The semi miraculously didn't crash. It was somehow able to re-straighten itself, and continue driving straight, like nothing ever happened, quickly regaining speed. Whatever this thing that I saw must have appeared out of the desert, jumped up onto the semi, and then onto the trailer, and then off into the darkness. Why, I have no idea. What was it? I have no idea. I wondered that the rest of my drive, all the way down to Brawley. I wish I had more of a story for you than that, but that's basically it. And now that it's been almost 10 years since that encounter, I can remember it pretty well, just like it happened to me last week. There is no doubt at all in my mind that what I encountered that night was in fact a Dogman. Let me take you back. The year was 1989, and I and my girlfriend had just graduated high school. So, we were going to start college that coming fall. It was June, where everything is thick with overgrowth. Summer is just about to start, and things are really getting hot. We were in the pinnacle of spring, and it's one of my favorite times of year. But that's not the point of the story. We had some close family friends that had a nice little cabin out by a lake. This was in Colorado, at a location I'm going to keep undisclosed. Our plan was to go up there for the weekend, Friday night, Saturday night, and leave Sunday morning. I wasn't really big into hunting or fishing, so my plan was to have a nice romantic getaway with my girlfriend. We had both just turned 18, so we were legal adults, which means we could bring cigarettes and semi-party without being caught. My plan was we would spend a lot of time by the lake, swimming and just relaxing, maybe even reading and doing other stuff that couples do. You get the hint, especially being 18 years old. After all, my hormones were raging. So, we get up there, we get everything set up, and the cabin is already pretty well put together. Our family friends that owned it kept it very well clean and furnished. There were several rooms with several beds, and they really only ever visit it a handful of times a year. Well, looking back, maybe it was more a handful of times in the spring and summer, so it was pretty well kept up on, and not deserted and desolate like you would imagine a cabin to be. Everything goes great that first night, and we have our first night together, completely alone. 2 18-year-olds, totally by themselves in the middle of the woods, next to a beautiful large lake, in their own cabin, with nobody around. That first night, we got a great night of sleep. We slept like babies, and were only awakened by the sun shining in our faces, telling us it was time to get up. I remember we spent that day out by the lake, swimming and just doing our thing, eating all the good food that we had packed. About evening time is when things started to get a little weird. My girlfriend at the time kept asking me, "Are you sure nobody's around here? Are you sure we don't have any neighbors? Are you sure there's no other campers?" And I remember I kept asking her, "Why do you say that? What's going on?" She told me at the time she just couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like there was somebody in the woods watching us. I had to reassure at the time that that wasn't the case, and we were the only ones around here. Boy, at the time was I wrong. But I didn't feel the feelings that she was feeling. I didn't sense that there was somebody watching us. So, I simply ignored it and just tried to reassure her that everything was okay. Which it was, until that night, when we started to hear sounds coming from outside the cabin. We decided that we would spend right before bed, reading our books, and just cuddling together. I'll spare you the vulgarity, and just let you know that we had plenty of time where we had romance. So, we were cuddling afterwards, reading our books. I remember it was roughly probably after 8 or 9. I don't know exactly the time, but I can tell you, it was just about dark. I think the sun had just finished settling. That's when we began to hear noises outside the cabin. My first inkling was that there was possibly a large bear outside. At the time, and still, I'm not really familiar or know anything about the wildlife in Colorado, or this area that we were in, but I figured the only thing that could be that big that was making this noise was that of a bear. I tried to downplay it as much as possible to keep my girlfriend from panicking and freaking out. Besides, no bear is going to try to break into your cabin. It was probably just bumbling through the area, and possibly smelt our food from earlier in the evening. No biggie. We had all of our trash inside. No food, nothing left outside for it to get into, or any reason to attract it into here. And then, everything got quiet. We had the windows slightly cracked, so the sound of crickets and the forest, which is very much so alive during this time of year, was like a chorus, a very, very loud chorus, had all of a sudden faded out and turned into utter silence. I noticed it right away because it came accompanied with a very bad feeling in my gut. One that I can't describe, even to this day. It's just a feeling that something is wrong. And so I wanted to inspect and check it out. At this moment, I didn't hear the supposed bear anymore, so I thought that that wasn't even a thing, that this bear that had walked through had already gone off. And besides, The noise had ceased probably a few minutes after. So, I got up, went to the cabin front door and opened it, and listened. Everything was still quiet. I couldn't see anything in front of me because of how dark it was, and the stars in the sky only illuminated some of everything around me. That's when my eyes, which were just now adjusting to the darkness around me, could make out movement coming towards the cabin. I squinted, and my eyes began to adjust more and more to the dark surrounding me. This large black shape began approaching us more and more. That's when I started to panic, and I slammed the door and ran back to my girlfriend. I told her that we might have trouble with a bear coming. She started getting scared, but I calmed her down and told her that we really have no problems if it's a bear. I mean, a bear's not going to break into the cabin after all. That's when I walked back to the cabin door and tried to listen. That's when I started hearing heavy footsteps. Footsteps that were clearly 2 feet and not 4, like a regular animal that lives in the forest. At this moment, my mind and gut instantly knew something was more than wrong. This wasn't an animal like I thought. This was something else, and I should have known, judging by the large black shape. It didn't resemble a bear on all fours. I couldn't really tell you what it was because it was so dark out. It was just some large black shape. But now, after about 30 seconds if not more, and it's right outside the cabin, I could hear it walking around, on 2 legs, just like a person. I began to get scared, thinking that maybe it was some large man coming out to rob us, or kill us, or worse. As quietly and fast as I could, I ran back to the room where my girlfriend was, and she was already hiding in the corner, under the window, so she couldn't be seen. She had heard this thing too, and whatever it was pacing around the cabin, slowly. Our window was still open, cracked, I should say, and we started to hear it, making noise. It was like a low, raspy growling, kind of like a dog does, but it sounded like a dog that had smoked an entire pack of cigarettes every day for 20 years. It was so raspy and low. I can't even begin to describe to you how bad it sounded, but it was so deep that we could feel the vibrations through the wall. Kind of like how if you blast the bass into music and how it hits your chest. That's how it was. Not because of the sheer volume of the growl, but because how much bass and rasp there was to it. It continued, whatever it was at the time, to pace around the cabin and past our window, back all the way around to the front. Then we didn't hear anything, until just a few moments later, when whatever this thing was began violently rattling the door handle to the front of the cabin. Luckily, I had just locked it right as I ran to my girlfriend, not even thinking, kind of just a secondary safety measure, something that I do subconsciously, and I'm lucky that I did. Whatever this thing was, I don't even know, was trying to get into our cabin. Once it began rattling the door handle, it began growling even louder, like an angry dog trying to break into the house. My girlfriend and I were petrified, frozen in fear, not knowing what to expect. Then, the door started slamming. Whatever this thing was, just like a person trying to break in, began slamming its body against the door. This went on for a good hour, or so it felt like, but it was probably only maybe 5 to 10 minutes. It seemed like a long time, violently trying to break the door down, shaking the door handle, banging all over the cabin, pacing around the cabin, growling, rumbling. We never exactly saw it up close, and thank goodness. I also don't know if whatever it was looking in the windows, because to be honest, me and my girlfriend stayed hidden, down in the corner of the room, never looking out the windows, never staying by the door. After a while, things got quiet, and even though the sounds outside remained silent, we didn't hear any more of the pacing, any more of the growling, any more of the rumbling of the door. The ominous presence that accompanied whatever this person was, or whatever this thing was now gone too, and only silence outside remained. I think we eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, not hearing anything anymore. When this thing was around, you knew it, because the footsteps were very heavy. Imagine somebody wearing iron boots that weighed 100 pounds each, stomping around on the dirt, Every thud, you would hear it and feel it. It was the most terrifying experience I've had since, and this was almost 31 years ago. I can still remember my girlfriend waking me up the following morning, right after. It was just as sun was coming up, and we decided to not take any more chances and get out of there post-haste. I remember as we were leaving the cabin and just grabbed all of our stuff, we saw outside large canine footprints. I'm talking large, far bigger than the size of my hand. I have no idea if it was a wolf or a dog or what it was. My girlfriend is unsure too. It was some sort of beast that lives out in the woods. I was sure of it. We got out of there so fast that the car was in complete disarray, but we didn't care. We didn't want to spend another minute there. Later on, far after we got back, our family was asking us how was the trip and if we enjoyed ourselves. We wanted to play everything off as cool, because we simply knew that if we told them what had happened, we would have been the laughing stock of the family, and they wouldn't believe us. So, again, we played it off as everything was cool, but just decided to never go back. Now, if we jump forward in time a little bit, say by about 20 years, it was right around 2009, 2010, nearly 20 years, is when I started to learn about a thing called the Dogman, but only very loosely, and I learned they were very prominent in the Michigan-Wisconsin area. But I paid no attention to that, because I didn't make the correlation then. Then, fast forward again, maybe another 4 to 5 years to 2015, 2016, and encounters with these things started coming out in droves. That's when I was finally able to listen and make the correct correlation that what we saw that night, or what we experienced, what was trying to break in, and supposedly probably trying to eat us, was indeed a dogman. I don't think there's any other explanation for it. There is no rational reasoning of any animal that it could have been. Nothing walks around in the woods in Colorado on 2 legs. Nothing sounds as big as that. Nothing stomps around, and nothing, and I repeat, nothing has canine tracks and tries to violently break the door down. I don't believe in werewolves or monsters, but I do believe in creatures that we can't see. Anyway, that's my experience, and I hope it serves you well in sharing it. You have full permission to use it however you will. Anybody that has been on the Navajo Res has either probably heard of or had some creepy things or experienced some pretty creepy things. Namely, Skinwalkers. I have only seen one, and here's my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S.'s largest Navajo Res to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo Res, and we usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning. But this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip. So, we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out, and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving, before we had entered into the res. By this time, everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles an hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at roughly 85 miles an hour. As this figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white, with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, it's a skinwalker. The skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurdling sagebrush and rocks while staring right at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I couldn't look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The thing just smiled at me, this very inhuman smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked, yellow, pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the entire ordeal. The skinwalker started to crumple down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair began appearing all over the skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert, far out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anybody, for fear they would think I was crazy. So, I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next day in school in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feather serpent-like thing, turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another skinwalker, and it might be due to the fact I moved away from that town and res, and if I do have to go south, I go around, way around. This story happened late June, right before the 4th of July. I don't know if I believe that this is what I truly experienced, but my best friend's great-grandmother is certain. For reference, I am a 20-year-old female. My fiancé and I finally had a few days off this summer and decided to take a little trip. We live in northern Utah and decided to head to Wyoming to buy some cool fireworks and camp out. Plus, his grandparents live very close to our desired camping location. My fiancé, whom for the story we'll call Jake, has a hatchback, and we planned on lowering the back seats and just sleeping in the car. After purchasing some fireworks, we head out to our camp location. It was called Blazon, or Blazon. The roads were rough and narrow, and there were about 1,000 wild rabbits running around. Other than that, the road was pretty clear. We parked our car behind a mountainous pile of rocks to block out as much light pollution from the nearest town as possible. I had never seen the stars so bright. It was still pretty light when we got there, and I took in as much of my surroundings as my eyes could handle. We made a fire as it started to darken. We cooked some hot dogs and set off some aerial fireworks before deciding to call it a night. We climbed in the car, and Jake fell asleep pretty quickly. I, however, felt very strange. I opened the back of the car to take in the silence, the pure blackness of the night. I've been camping before, but I had never felt like this. I wasn't scared, but I wasn't comforted. The blackness ahead of me felt almost unreal, like I could reach out and touch rich black velvet. Or perhaps it felt like a projection, like what I was seeing wasn't real. I decided to call it a night and shut the hatch. I didn't sleep very well. We woke up fairly early, at about 6:30 a.m. We had planned to go shooting a bit, since I had never seen so much as held a gun, and go to Opal for arrowhead and rock hunting. I exited the car and walked a few feet away to pee, and literally 10 feet to the left of the car was a sheep's corpse. Like I said, I took a good look around when we first arrived. It wasn't too dark for me to notice the previous day. In fact, our campfire was about 5 feet from it. Out of morbid curiosity, I went to investigate. It was probably the most disturbing and eerie thing I had ever seen. It looked freshly killed, yet the sheep's innards and bones were entirely gone, other than the skull. The eyeballs were still intact, and that's usually the first part of a body to decompose. It was like it was completely hollowed out, but there was no blood anywhere. No dried blood, or any sign that this was an animal's meal. Something else I noticed that was strange was the skin looked almost leathered where it was peeled back. But seeing as it was so fresh, I knew that was impossible. I yelled to Jake, who had been camping in this area very many times in his lifetime, to see if he had any ideas. He was completely baffled. We decided to just sleep in his grandparents' house that night, so we quickly packed up and left. As we were leaving, I saw yet another sheep's corpse, exactly like the other, right on the side of the road that we had traveled on to get there. There was no way we could have missed that. We were paying very close attention to the road because of all the rabbits. Now, I was really uncomfortable. However, the rest of the trip was a lot of fun. In fact, while we were shooting, I found half an antelope's skull that was a bit bleached by the sun. I thought it was pretty cool, so I put on some gloves and bagged it up, with the intent of cleaning and sanitizing it when I got home. Once we got back home, I decided to stop by and see my best friend. We were driving down the road, smoking cigarettes, when my car suddenly broke down. I was feeling pretty unhappy, but while we waited for my father to come help me tow it or push it to the nearby mechanic to leave overnight, I told her about my weird sheep corpses. My best friend is Native American, and immediately got very extremely uncomfortable and told me to talk to her great-grandmother. I agreed, and visited within the next few days after my car had been repaired. However, I fell very ill the day after my car broke down. I had the flu, which was unusual for the time of year. I wanted to keep my visit brief in fear of getting them sick, but I ended up staying there all night. I told her about my experience with the sheep, the weird feeling I had that first night, and the antelope skull. She was positive I came across something called a skinwalker, a person, a witch, with the supernatural ability to turn into any animal he or she desires, to be able to transform. Legends sometimes require that the skinwalker wears a pelt of the animal. They are believed to be very evil, and Native Americans refuse to talk about them at night, which explained why my best friend was so uncomfortable. Her great-grandmother also mentioned that running into a skinwalker can cause disease and bad luck, like my car breaking down and contracting the flu. After her telling me all of this, I was really scared and overwhelmed. She asked me if I took any strange souvenirs, and I told her about the antelope skull. She told me to go home, bury it in a field, and I should be fine after that. Well, I did just that. As soon as I came home, I grabbed a shovel and the skull, went to an old field and buried it. I burned some sage after I buried it at the site, in my car and in my room. However, she said that may not take care of my bad luck, and she's right. My car continues to mysteriously break down, again and again, immediately following repairs. I don't really know what to believe. Bad luck happens, and my car is a bit old, and it's bound to have problems, and I frequently still get sick. But I still can't explain what I saw, and why I felt what it felt. Does anyone have any suggestions or ideas? If this really is the work of a skinwalker, I need to know what to do, just to get my life back on track. I'm a poor college student, and I can't afford fixing my car. I just replaced the power steering rack, and that set me back $600. Immediately after getting that repaired, my brake light and training light came on. I checked my transmission fluid, and there's definitely a leak or something going on. Any advice or speculation is always appreciated. The backwoods of North Carolina are full of old, sleeping houses that ought to be torn down. They dream only awful things. I grew up in a very, very small farm town with a population below 150 or so people. I won't name drop the town for obvious reasons, and even if I did, you wouldn't find anything to write home about. There's a caution light and several abandoned buildings, a barely functional gas station that will grossly overcharge you, and that's about it. You go more than a half a mile in any direction, and you will officially be outside of city limits. Though there are dozens of people who live in these heavily wooded farmlands that call the town home, simply because it's the closest thing in the shouting distance. Though that would be akin to saying that Mars was within shouting distance of Earth. I've had a few experiences in these woods that I can't fully explain. I can describe them, and I will, but I cannot offer any scientific explanation for them. I know that tales of wendigos and skinwalkers and other natural forest demon spooks are popular, but wendigos are a creature that belong to the tribal legends of tribes centered around the Great Lakes region of the northern United States, like Wisconsin, Michigan, and into the eastern coast of Canada. Skinwalkers are exclusively tied to the Navajo religion and Navajo grounds, which are in the deserts of the far west of the U.S. Keep that in the back of your mind. I first began to notice the presence when I was around 12. Playing in the woods was really the only pastime I had available to me, outside of playing video games. But video games got old rather quickly. I was an only child, and there weren't any other children in the area, so exploring the woods was good at first for the outlet of my imagination. Prior to my first experience, the spookiest thing in the woods around here would have been venomous snakes. Even then, snakes we have aren't likely to kill you unless you just seriously neglect the wound or have an allergic reaction. Aside from them, the largest predators we have are coyotes, which are mostly afraid of humans, and the rare cougar that happens to be passing through, which is so infrequent that it isn't worth worrying over. So, the first day in question was a normal summer day. I was out hiking, collecting rocks, building forts out of sticks. You know, the standard things a 12-year-old boy does. It was about sundown, and I wasn't quite ready to head home yet, when I noticed something was off. During the summer in North Carolina, the woods are anything but quiet. You have a cacophony of sounds. Crickets, frogs, birds. There's a whole chorus of wildlife that all wants to be heard. You may even get the occasional coyote pack howling, or a bobcat screaming. The point of this is the woods are far from quiet, and sudden silence in the wood in these times is not an accident. But that's precisely what I noticed. All the noises had stopped. I could hear the wind between the mixture of old growth and pines, and I could hear the distant babbling of a creek. But that was it. This was strange to me, but at the time, I didn't realize what an ill omen was in and of itself. I actually remember thinking that the water sounded peaceful, and walking deeper into the woods to listen to it better. As I did, though, I began to get this overwhelming sense of foreboding. It wasn't the standard, I feel like I'm being watched. No, I didn't feel any eyes on me, or feel like I was being followed, or any of those standard paranoias. This was like, have you ever stayed at a party too? You know, you get there at 9, and now it's 2 a.m., and suddenly, you realize that you don't know anyone who is still there. You also didn't see this new guy come in, but he's glaring at you. And come to think about it, so was that girl in the kitchen. You've overstayed your welcome, and it's probably time to go. That's exactly what I felt like, even if I lacked the metaphor to express it at the time. The air itself felt heavy. Everything in my mind and body was screaming at me that I needed to leave, that this place was not mine anymore. It had been fine in the morning hours, but now, this was the domain of someone or something else, and I wasn't welcome. I remember feeling as if the trees were warning me, leave or else. So I did. Initially, I walked, but by the time the sun had begun its descent and the sky had begun to darken in the twilight, I was jogging. I never broke into a full-on sprint. I don't know why, but I felt showing too much fear was a bad idea. Eventually, I made it back to the road and looked back to the woods. I didn't see anything, but that's when the feeling of being watched set in. I felt that there were eyes just beyond the tree line and out of sight, and that were staring right back at me. I went home and pushed the experience out of my mind as best as I could. From then on, I made it a point to always be out in the woods by dark, or to have a firearm with me if I knew I was staying later. I should note to you that there were several times after that I wound up in the woods at dusk, but did not have this feeling return. There weren't any special circumstances that seemed to summon it. Just sometimes things were fine. Others, I all but sprinted for civilization. I didn't have any more overt experiences, however, until years later. I don't know what the catalyst was, but the activity ramped up dramatically in a year's span. The first was like this, and was in October of 2018. And since then, the woods have gone from a home for the occasional unsettling experience to a place of actual danger and terror. I went camping with some college friends of mine during the October in question. In total, there were just 3 of us, and were mostly roughing it. We had a tent, but we chopped our own firewood, and all of that jazz. We had camped pretty deep in the woods. It was dark by the time we were fully set up, and had finished cooking. We ate, and then we proceeded to get very drunk. I don't know how much we actually drank, as we were just sipping out of a handle of vodka and passing it around the campfire as we talked about everything from ghost stories to the more tangible fears in our lives, such as dating and the prospect of post-graduation. This went on well into the night, with the stories growing more nonsensical and the laughter growing louder as the bottle grew lighter. By around 1:30 a.m., it had grown deathly cold. I decided that that was night for me, and I was going to get into my sleeping bag. The other 2 weren't ready to sleep yet, and one of my friends, we'll call him Frank, decided he wanted to smoke a cigarette. Meanwhile, the other friend, we'll call him Tim, decided that this was a good time for him to go climb a large rock, about 70 or so yards away from the tent. Frank begrudgingly goes to supervise him while he finishes off his cigarette. So they're both a good 70, maybe 80 yards away from the tent. I'm now in my sleeping bag and trying to fall asleep, and I could hear them laughing and talking, and it's obviously far away. It's right at this time that something heavy slams into the side of the tent. Heavy enough that I'm surprised the tent didn't actually collapse. I didn't move. I was drunk, but not so drunk as to not realize that whatever was out there didn't stop to borrow a cup of sugar. That sense of dread filled me at once, and even though I had my shotgun with me, I couldn't bring myself to reach for it. I felt staying still was a much safer approach. I heard something breathing. It wasn't human breathing though. This was loud and weirdly wet sounding. It wasn't sniffing or anything like that. Just deep breathing. This only went on for a total fewer than 10 seconds, and all at once, it was gone. No footsteps, no banging on the tent, no gradual decline in breathing. Nothing. It was gone, and Frank and Tim had never seen that it was there, let alone what it might have been. It's honestly probably best they didn't. They stayed up a while longer before turning in. I woke up first, stepped out to see if there were any footprints, and there weren't. But there was something much more ominous. The entire clearing we were camping in now had, scattered throughout the grass and early morning frost, circles of bones. Not large bones, but crushed up and arranged bones of small creatures, like a rabbit or a small bird maybe. I would assume we were in a predator's hunting ground, save for the fact that bones were neatly arranged in circles, all of the same sizes and with equal spacing. I woke Tim and Frank up. We packed up and left immediately. This last experience is the most recent and the most intense. There was a meteor shower not too long ago, and I returned to the clearing where my friends and I went camping to observe it, as there is very little light pollution. It was stellar, and I loved every second of it. But I wasn't out there long where my dog, I brought him with me, he's good company, started acting strange. He had pinned his hair back while lying down and was now staring very intently at the tree line. He wasn't barking or growling. In fact, he was silent and just watching. It was strange, but I assumed he'd caught wind of a deer or other prey animal, and he was on the hunt, though he was far too lazy to actually go and chase it. After a moment, a nearby coyote howled. I felt a wave of relief, as my dog's behavior was beginning to make me uneasy. He was just tense by the coyote, and it would pass. There was something wrong, though. First, coyotes hunt in packs. It's extremely uncommon for a solo coyote to hunt and howl like this. And second, my dog had begun to whimper, now, and was shying back to the edge of the truck, as though he were afraid. And the coyote was drawing closer, it seemed. My brain began connecting a lot of the dots. The woods were silent. The feeling had returned. I was in the same spot as the last encounter. And then I registered the sounds of branches breaking. Coyotes aren't heavy enough to do that, I thought. And the second I did, as though whatever was out there had waited for me to realize it, the coyote stopped pretending to be one. Or at least I don't know. It stopped howling. It then erupted into the most horrible sound I have ever heard. The coyote was laughing. It wasn't a hyena sort of laugh, though. It was this garbled, mangled mess of sound that sounded like an animal trying and doing a piss-poor job to impersonate the cadence of a human laughter. And it was on this recording track, where every fourth laugh it seemed to loop. It was rapidly growing louder over the sound of breaking branches. I frantically jumped up, grabbed my dog, and fumbled for my truck keys to get out of there. As I tried to get my keys and get my door open, the laughing stopped, only for this guttural and deep scream to resound from the forest. I say deep to emphasize that it wasn't a bobcat or a fox. They have high-pitched sounds. This was very low. It had the same pitch as, say, a roar, but it was that same horribly botched nonsense that the laugh was in. Of course, the laughter resumed immediately, but as I got in my truck and turned the lights on, dead silence. In a moment of stupid bravado and curiosity, I turned my truck towards the tree line before I left to shine my headlights and see if I saw anything. Between the trees, I saw what seemed to be a man. He was of average height and wearing a white t-shirt, and I assume blue jeans, though I could not see a face or arms or anything of that nature. Just his silhouette and his clothes. In hindsight, I think he was only a silhouette, maybe. I blinked and he was gone. That's my story. I don't know what it is in the backwoods of North Carolina. I don't want to know. And it's probably best you don't try to find out. It doesn't seem too welcoming to strangers after all. The Mothman is one of those things that happens to just divide people into two different camps. Those that think it's dumb, and those that think it's an intelligent and sentient being, and has its own motives. I lean towards the second. I only saw the Mothman once, ever, and the encounter not only came to define my life ever after, but it remains my earliest and most vivid childhood memory. I was 7 years old, and my parents had a home in the suburbs of Chicago. I know what you're thinking when you hear Chicago. Skyscrapers and carbon dioxide. But where we lived, it was as country as a turnip green, and pretty quiet. Monsters were the last thing on my mind, at least not other than the ones that we heard about in the news that came from the cities. I was out having fun in a cluster of trees one day. I could tell that the sun would set soon, and I was beginning to head home, when I became aware of a sort of strange buzzing sound. I couldn't tell you if it was something that I heard, or if it was something that I actually felt. I just remember the sensation in my ears and on my skin at the same time, like a bad setting on a massage bed. The sensation was distracting, and I missed the shape that leapt overhead from the branches of one tree to another. Just as I was starting to get enough sense in me to persist in moving towards home, the shape came down from the trees and landed directly in my path. The new proximity of the presence made the buzzing so intense, it was just a few steps away from being agony. The figure that stood before me was a little more than a shadow in the evening light, and yet it seemed like it would appear to be a shadow even at high noon, as light seemed to be absorbed and refracted by the being, rather than reflected by it. It was horrifying. The only part of it that didn't swallow light was its horrible eyes, which were two bulging spheres of unnerving red light. Their glow guttered slightly, with a cold fire of bioluminescence. As soon as I was looking into those eyes, I couldn't look away. The buzzing began dialing into my thoughts, with a language that I didn't speak and that I couldn't understand. Whatever this thing was, I didn't know it was Mothman at the time. It was trying to speak to me telepathically, in some sort of demonic language. I could only observe how my mind was reacting to it. I couldn't tell if it was psychic or something more. 3 times the buzzing sensation ramped up to an unbearable intensity, like I was being punched or whipped or slapped from the inside out. On the 3rd stroke, my vision went blurry, and I passed out. I woke up in my bed, and the memories were distant enough to make me question if I had dreamed the whole thing. When my parents entered my bedroom to check on me, the looks on their faces told me that I had dreamed none of it. Like any 7-year-old would, I told my story of the horrific monster that I witnessed, as if I were relating something perfectly matter of fact, and I described the things that it did to me as best as afforded by my limited 7-year-old vocabulary. Nobody believed me. I mean, how could they? Asking anyone to believe in a 9-foot entity resembling a demonic moth that went around giving children migraines was a high price. Asking for an additional leap of faith in that notion that said demonic moth was now outside of its native home, it wasn't until later in life that I could tell that my encounter with the Mothman wasn't just a benign crossing of paths. Rather, it had seeded something inside of me. I became intimately acquainted with anxiety and dread. Right before something awful would happen in my world, I would feel that buzzing sensation. Sometimes it would be subtle, as a tingling in my fingertips. Other times it was unbearable, as if one of my limbs had been asleep for hours. Or it would be deafening, keeping me from sleep. But without fail, whenever the sensation came, trouble accompanied it. I'm in my 30s now, and over the years, I've done my research on this thing. It itself has built a reputation as being a harbinger of doom, like a bad omen appearing before disaster, much the same way of its appearance back in the 1960s and the great collapse of the bridge. Don't think it's a curse that I could hammer out into a blessing. My experience with the Mothman might be a little different than anything else you've read, but it still holds a common thread with the other accounts for one simple fact. Nothing, literally nothing, has ever occurred in connection with the Mothman that has ever been good. My experience with the Mothman isn't all that big, and yet somehow it is. I'll tell you, and you decide what to think. I'm from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the supposed nest of the beast, I guess. I was in college at the time. Me and my buddies had made it in all together, so it was only a matter of time before we got in trouble. My friend Jack had met a girl that he really liked, and all of her friends were boy-hungry and were eager to pair off with the rest of us. Looking back, it's questionable if they even really liked us. But when you're a college brat, you don't always need a reason to do things, especially things that involve the opposite sex. All we knew was that we were together, and each of us had a girl that we thought we could call our own, and we had access to some pretty decent alcohol and no adult supervision. Add that to the ingredient of there being woods nearby in any direction, and you went viola, the perfect recipe for a good time, or so I thought. The girl I had paired off with for the reason of college was your stereotypical flowsy blonde, and for the sake of the story, we'll call her Cheryl. We sat around the campfire. Before long, we kind of weren't talking to each other anymore, but pawing at our dates. Me and her got the notion to go play hide and seek in the deep dark woods. So, we stumbled over the bodies of some of our lightweights in our group and went off into the pines. I couldn't see her, but I could hear her. She was giggling uncontrollably, and at the time, it was the cutest thing in the world. I don't really know at what point I stopped hearing her giggle, but I could still hear her movement all around me. I figured my senses must have been royally blunted because she suddenly had this incredible speed. When I was closing in on her in one direction, it seemed like she would disappear and reappear behind me. And then, when I would turn around, the sound of her feet were somewhere else. I finally yelled out that it was time to stop screwing around. A voice answered me, but it wasn't Cheryl's. It automatically dialed my dread knob up to 100, despite my intoxication. Imagine hearing that sound while you're all alone in the dark, when you thought you were alone with your girlfriend, and you suddenly realize she's not there. Well, that's how I felt. The sound had made me stand still for a moment, but then, my eyes had more or less adjusted to the dark. I didn't exactly have the help of a lot of moonlight, but I could pick out the shapes of the trees. And then a towering figure tiptoed from behind one tree and crossed my view to disappear behind another tree. It did it exactly the way that I expected Cheryl would have, except that this was coming from something so tall and so inhumanly grotesque in shape, with two demonic wings folded up behind it, with long behemoth arms held out at its sides, and two red eyes staring directly at me, into me. This was a living demon. It stopped to observe me, like a frightened insect up from the trees. I took off running as fast as I could, back to the safety of the fire. The good news is that I found Cheryl next to the campfire. She had lost me about the same time I had lost her, so she just found her way back and passed out. Well, fast forward in time, and things got a lot worse. She passed away not long after this sighting, with what I would learn to be was the Mothman. She was found in her dorm, unconscious. She hadn't shown up for class in several days, and her friends went to check up on her. She was rushed to the hospital, only to be pronounced dead. She had overdosed on heroin. I don't know if that's one of the disasters that Mothman's appearance supposedly predicts, but did occur after my own personal encounters with this monster. I'll never know, and it's all the same if I never find out. I can't tell you my name or where I actually work, but for the sake of what I have to relate to you, I will say that my name is Jim, and I will tell you that I work at a national park where the stone is a particularly sunny color. I know you usually deal in cryptid stories, but I've come across some things that are just as odd. There's a few kiddie playgrounds scattered throughout the whole park, and often enough, it's my job to patrol these in a regular circuit, just to make sure that bears and other predators are keeping their distance from children. The way I usually carry this out, I park my squad car and sit and watch for a few moments. Then I get out and take a stroll. If all's well, I roll onto the next playground. In the middle of one exceptionally boring day on a kiddie patrol, I was strolling during a busy hour where kids were out of the school, and parents were letting them all run wild, probably hoping they wouldn't take any of that energy home. I watched a little boy that reminded me very much of my own. A little girl with very white, rather pale skin and straight black hair ran over to him and asked him if he wanted to come meet her grandparents. They were sitting over on a park bench with their backs to us. I smiled at how easily children could make friends. Towards the end of the day, there was an announcement of an Amber Alert. A small boy had gone missing, and when a picture of the boy was officially released, my heart sank. It was the exact little boy I had seen on the playground with a pale little girl. There were gears turning in the back of my head all night, and I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me. The next day, I was on patrol again, with orders to keep my eyes peeled for that little boy, just in case he turned back up. I kept my eyes peeled for him all day. He'd been hard to miss. He looked just like my kid. I saw the same little girl from day before, with the pale skin and darker hair. She came up to another little girl and asked her if she'd like to meet her grandparents. That's when those gears in my head began working again. There were again 2 older folks sitting with their back to all the kids sitting on the park bench, further up the park trail. My eyes shifted over to the dark-haired girl and her new friend, who was agreeing to meet her grandma and grandpa. I made my move. I asked her if I can meet her grandma and grandpa too. She wasn't too happy to see me. She looked like I was ruining some of her fun. She took the other girl's hand and led her up the trail, keeping me in sight with a sidelong look. I followed from a distance. The 2 girls stood in front of the couple. The dark-haired girl was definitely not happy to see me. The other girl looked confused, even a little frightened. The dark-haired girl motioned for the other girl to go, and they both ran back to the playground. I strolled up to the older folks who didn't seem to notice me. I called out a greeting, so as to not startle them. I thought they might be hard of hearing because they didn't stir a bit. When I came around to stand in front of them, I could see the 2 of them were withered up, dead bodies, dry as dead leaves. Another Amber Alert went out that night. That time, for the other little girl, the dark-haired one that led away from me. I don't know if anybody's going to believe this story or not, but there's only one way to find out. When you see the small town that I live in, you wonder why they even bother setting aside funds for patrols of the parks. I guess you just never know when trouble is going to come from the outside world into our little sacred quiet place. But something that happened recently has made me question whether trouble always comes from the outside. Our parks are small, but they are just big enough to have a couple of walking trails. If a day is feeling especially slow, I'll take the time to walk these trails for the hell of it. On paper, that means that I'm making absolutely sure that there's no trouble whatsoever. So, one day, I'm walking the trail, and I get a real strong whiff of something good and dead. Not unlike the smell that might come from under your front porch when a squirrel or something else has crawled away to die, maybe poisoned. But this was really strong. Strong enough to make me question the size of the carcass. Once I could tell which direction the wind was coming from, I started to follow the smell. It led me off the trail and into a thick of trees. The more crowded the trees, the worse the smell got. This brought me into a very, very small clearing that I actually didn't know existed. Here, I discovered scraps of sheet metal cobbled together into something like a shrine, complete with a peaked, corrugated roof. Small scraps were arranged into an altar. Behind it was a corpse that was set upright by a virtue of railroad spikes driven through the chest and shoulders, pinning it to a large wooden crate. The legs were posed cross-legged, and the head had been removed and replaced with the skull of a buck with large antlers. Pink still stained the skull, telling me that both the head and the corpse were about as fresh. Loud flies filled the air. I don't know what to phone any of this as if it couldn't get any stranger. I saw something under the skull, lodged in the neck. Papers. They were papers rolled up and weighed down by the skull. I phoned the whole thing in and waited for dispatch. Nobody ever came. I raced a haul over it, but everyone I mentioned it to just looked at me like they didn't know what I was talking about, or they just didn't care. I called the paper to tell them about what I had found, but as soon as I told them which park, they just hung up on me. Nobody around here is listening, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't think there's anything I can do. This experience, or encounter, whatever you want to call it, has cost me my job. For various reasons, I started to keep a bottle of whiskey on me when I was riding around the park in the patrol car. Things were not good at home, and they weren't good on the job either, so I turned to what I knew: alcoholism. It's gotten me through some pretty rough times in my past, so it's my crutch. I stopped the car when I rolled past somebody that was sleeping on a park bench. Looked to be a male, wrapped in a coat, from what I could tell. When I came up to him, the smell was overwhelming. I tried to rouse him and tell him no sleeping, especially on the benches, but he turned his head to look at me with the cloudiest eyes I've ever seen. He swiftly took the bottle of whiskey from my hand, chugged it, tossed it, and ran. I tackled him, and I heard a horrible snapping sound. He wouldn't talk or open his eyes or anything, so I had to call this one out and tell him myself, 'cause I was pretty sure I accidentally broke his neck. The disturbing part is that even though I got busted for the alcohol and got punished, the coroner had told me that he had been dead for well over 2 days. There's no way to explain the supernatural account of this. I'm the only on-duty park ranger for a nature preserve that's smaller than most city parks. I wear my title proudly, and I have wondered often, though, why they never hired more than one person. I'm the only person. The preserve is mostly prairie land with clumps of forest here and there. Between trees are oceans of tall grass. Weather permitting, I do most of my work from an abandoned lookout tower. Well, only abandoned because I'm really the only one there. One evening, as the last of the sun was sinking below the horizon, I was up in that tower, and I saw some sort of light in the grass down below. I wanted to write them off as fireflies, but the lights were too intense, and they weren't the right color. They were lit up too long to be fireflies, and they shimmered like fire, but they didn't stay lit up long enough for me to tell what they were. So, I took out a flashlight and descended the ladder to investigate. As soon as I cast the beam of my flashlight into a cluster of lights, I got the fright of my life when a sudden explosion of all sorts of crazy bestial sounds, snarls, barks, roars, all layered onto each other like there was a team of bears and dogs and wolves on leashes. The grass where I shone my light was boiling with movement, and strange lights swarmed there. I turned my light off, This didn't make anything happen for a few moments. Then the sound stopped, and several lights scattered in all directions, like a bad firework. It took me a while to come down from that tower that night. I still have no explanation for what any of those sounds could have been from. Long ago, a kid had gone missing from one of the parks that I worked at. I mean, you couldn't miss this kid. He looked like his parents had fed him 4 square meals of butter every day. I combed that park for days and found no one. But I did notice that in the distance, I kept spotting a set of antlers that seemed rather long, unnaturally long. I wondered how no hunter had gotten about to bagging a buck with a rack like that. One day, my curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to get a closer look at the animal. Naturally, it kept its distance, but I followed. Tracking it caused me to stumble upon a crude scarecrow in the middle of a glade of prairie grass. The sight of it unsettled me for reasons I couldn't place. But then the scarecrow made a few whimpering sounds. I cut the ropes and unwound the ragged cloth, and there was the missing kid. He didn't look right. He looked much worse than someone had been tied to a pole and stood out in a field. Tears flowed from his purple and red eyes as he couldn't stop talking about how hungry he was. So hungry. And the talking deer sometimes brought him other kids to eat, but it was never enough. He was still so hungry. A shriek from behind me made my ears ring. I turned to see the antlers coming up on me quickly. I could see then the patches of tan leather stretched among the curves and points of the horns. They displayed symbols that looked like they had been Native American, but they couldn't be. They were too infernal. They radiated an unsettling energy, like they were mirrors reflecting death from an evil sun. That child begged for help, but the thing with the antlers was upon him in a burst of speed, faster than lightning. And both of them were a blurred shadow that sailed over the hills and out of my sight. As if to confirm what the kid had told me, other reports of vanishing children that had been last seen in the park began to roll in. You're the first person I've shared this story with. I'm afraid that if I've told my superiors, they would begin to question if I had something to do with this missing child. I know it sounds made up, I get that, but I guess sometimes in life, truth is stranger than fiction. It's been almost 7 years now since I was visiting Mono Lake with a friend in California. My friend and I were chased by something that we can only describe looked like some sort of horrible monster with a large head of a dog that walked upright just like a person, with large teeth that stuck out of its mouth, with large claws and no visible tail. This happened earlier in the morning, and nobody else was there at the time, and as we approached the lake, we were chased by what we can only describe as this creature. It broke and burst out of the trees like nobody's business, and began to charge at us, angrily, as if we had disturbed it or even chased off its meal. We were terrified, and ran and retreated back to our car, where we drove out of there so quickly. Whatever this thing was continued to pursue our car, and kept chasing us until we were far out of sight of the area. One thing that really stuck out to me was just how thin and skinny this thing looked. Sure, it was very tall, but it had a very thin, tapered waist, and even the chest wasn't very large. But the arms, they hung down very low on its body. They were disproportionately long, and its legs resembled that of a dog, so when it walked upright, it looked awkward, and its back was even hunched, but it looked like it was able to keep its balance quite well, and it didn't have any problems running on 2 legs. And never saw it once switch onto 4 legs. It only stayed on 2, and continued to pursue us for a little while. Once it disappeared, that was the last we saw of it. In the time since then, I have read reports online about people seeing a similar being that exists around that area in California. They describe it as half man, half dog, but it didn't really resemble that of a human or a man if you ask me. Even though it walked upright like a person and was disproportionate in its body size and style, it didn't really resemble a man. It was more just like a large, upright canine that was really, really skinny. I had a very frightening experience that took place back in 1997 in Plumas County. I can't remember the exact location, but I was driving on a highway somewhere in the woods. I think it was near Greenville, to be exact. I also don't remember the time of year, but I know that it was not fall or winter, so it was probably sometime in the spring or summer. Anyway, I guess those details are relevant. At the time, I was driving my beater, which was an old Ford pickup. I was coming around a bend in the road at about 45 miles an hour when this large wolf animal jumped out onto the road and literally attacked my vehicle. With its hands, or what I would describe as hands, held onto my door handle and tried to yank the door open in an effort to pull me out of the car. It looked up at me with the most human-like eyes I can possibly imagine. The expression on its face was devilish, and like it had evil intentions, like it wanted to rip me out and eat me right then and there. Of course, when this thing jumped out and grabbed hold of my vehicle, it was almost like a trap, like it was waiting right around the bend for me to show up, and as soon as I drove in the right place at the right time, this thing made its move, jumped out, and even though I'm going 40-45 miles an hour, was able to grab hold of my door and try to yank it open with incredible strength. I felt my car give a little bit. I understand this might be hard to grasp, or understand that this all happened in one solid fluid motion, but as soon as it grabbed hold of my hand, I looked over at this thing and it made eye contact with me, all while I'm going 45 miles an hour around this bend. I look back to the road and I floor it out of a sudden adrenaline rush, and this thing lets go and starts chasing my truck. Then, within seconds, leaps up into the air, probably 12 feet, and jumps into the bed of my truck, then proceeds to smash its paw through my back window. And keep in mind, this beater isn't anything special. It's a rinky-dink 2-seat truck and has a little back window like every truck does. Whatever this werewolf creature was, smashed its paw or fist, whatever, into the back window, trying to grab hold of me, but for some reason couldn't. Probably because I was swerving all over the road, and it's only by the grace of God that there wasn't any oncoming traffic, or anybody behind or in front of me, because there for sure would have been an accident. No questions asked about that. Within seconds I made a sharp turn to my right, and nearly threw this thing out of the bed of my pickup truck. I almost had a head-on collision with a large oak tree, until I finally rotated the wheel enough that I could actually stabilize and straighten out my truck, and floor it out of there. I think I knocked this thing onto the pavement, and it seemed stunned, but when I kept checking back in my rearview mirror, it was gone. I never saw this thing disappear, nor did I ever see this thing jump off into the woods, so I don't know what happened to it, or where it went off to. For all I knew, it was paralleling me in the woods, and I had no idea, so I floored it even faster and got out of there. This was easily one of my most traumatic experiences that I've ever gone through, and you wouldn't imagine explaining how I got my back window punched in to my girlfriend at the time. I couldn't tell her some Wolfman thing did it, or that it jumped in the bed of my truck and nearly tried to kill me, so I had to make up a story that I was being dumb and threw a rock at my back window. Trust me, I got the cold shoulder for months afterwards, and was even forced to sleep out on the couch. But what was I supposed to do? Nobody would have believed my story. Sometimes when I think back on it, and I think the world we live in, I question if I'm not going crazy, that it was some sort of nightmare, that I just envisioned the whole thing, that maybe, just maybe, I fell asleep at the wheel. But I know for sure what happened. It's just too vivid of a memory. I'll never forget the eyes and the way it looked at me. It looked animalistic, but there was something behind the eyes, something that told me that it had intent, very evil intent, that wanted to hurt me, do damage to me, get to me, like it was waiting for me, I'll never be able to accurately come up with an explanation for that. I don't even think anything can really explain that. My close friend just very recently introduced me to your channel, but more importantly, your Dogman playlist that has nearly 200 videos worth of encounters. Now, I've only begun to scratch the surface and dig through a few, but you seem like you know a lot about these creatures, which begs me to ask the burning question. Have you ever heard of or know anything about supposed buffalo wolves? Well, the reason I ask you, a few years back, a close buddy of mine believed he shot one of these things in eastern Idaho, or maybe it was closer to Montana. Either way, he was elk hunting and apparently came upon a juvenile whatever these things are. It stood up on two legs and tried to attack him, but he brought his magnum with him and blew part of its shoulder out, and I believe it bled to death by what he told me. He said this sucker's ugly as can be, and has ever only heard of buffalo wolves before, and about how large they can actually get up to. But he's pretty sure this was one of them, and that it was a juvenile, because he said it was much smaller than what he's heard. He said it was maybe around 5'4", 5'5" if he had to guess, and even though it had a really large head, it was still shorter than him. My friend who shot him is about 5'10", 5'11". He had just gotten a good kill, and apparently, this thing showed up out of nowhere and tried to not only attack him, but he believes it was planning to steal his kill. Well, he thought quick and killed whatever this thing was. His plan was to actually come back for the body of this thing and probably get meat off it from what I guess. Or maybe he wanted it taxidermied. I'm not exactly sure. But he got his kill and hauled it back. And then, when he came back for his buffalo wolf kill the next day, it was gone. Like it had just gotten up and left. There were even no signs of the blood that occurred the day before. And then he told me about when he came back to this area the following day to retrieve the kill of this buffalo wolf, that the entire area just felt different, like he was being watched from afar or all around him, and that he was expecting something bad to happen at any given moment. Well, safe to say he didn't stick around very long and got out of there. He describes the whole thing as very strange that a kill that large would just be removed without question, and with no traces of blood or any trailing in the dirt that would indicate some sort of predator dragging the body off or even being feasted upon. It was just gone, like it never happened, like it vanished out of thin air. There's nothing that could explain that, since it hadn't even been a full 24 hours since he killed whatever this thing was that he believed to be a juvenile buffalo wolf. This is a friend of mine who's been hunting for a very long time, and does his same routine just about every year, and always goes around eastern Idaho into Montana. Nothing he did was out of the ordinary, or out of change for him, but whatever this thing was, he's only ever heard of them before, and never actually seen one until this time. He even told me that whatever this thing was took him by surprise, which is why he was shocked and scared, and had he not blown this thing's shoulder open, it would have taken his life, and probably ripped his throat out. It appeared to be very aggressive and hostile, he said. He wonders if he approached on its territory, or if it was solely intent on killing him, eating him, and taking the elk kill he had just gotten. And the area in which he was hunting is more of a desolate private area. He doesn't know if it's government-owned or privately owned, but there's not that many people that know about it. It's one of those places that's kind of off a dirt road, which is off another dirt road, which is off a large gravel road, which is off a back road. You know how those things go. Especially if you're a hunter and have gone down those kind of routes before and searched for game trails and places to hunt. I believe him, and I don't feel like he has any reason to make this up. He's not seeking notoriety or fame by any means. In fact, he even wanted me to keep his name anonymous, and was very adamant about getting the idea that these things are really out there, and that they do exist. And people who do hunt, especially in the thick woods and mountains, need to be very careful and always bring extra firearms, and that these things can be taken down if you shoot them properly. Don't be afraid, just be armed. Although it's already been almost 14 years to the day, I encountered something horrendous when I was out down in the Sonoran Desert years and years ago with a couple of close friends of mine exploring. Before you write me off as a phony for exploring the soaring heat of the desert, since it usually can get up to 120 degrees, my friends and I felt pretty acclimated and would go and explore in short bursts when we could. We've always been fascinated by the desert climate, the environment, the plants, and just the plains itself. Just being out in that environment, it brings something out of you, something that yearns to learn more about the earth itself. I only have a little bit of native in me, and I'm not exactly sure what tribe, but I have a very few close circle of friends that are full native, and it's always been our thing to go and explore the areas we can that are close by, even if it is for only short little bursts of time due to the extreme heat and dryness. Before I continue my story, I want you to know that before I did this, I was well aware of the things that live out in the desert, supposedly, like skinwalkers and other supernatural entities that are said to do harm to you. Well, during the daytime, I figured we'd be fine and didn't pose any threat or any alertness to any supernatural entities looking to do harm. That's where I had it wrong, and although I don't consider what we ran into a supernatural entity, it is something of evil, or so I believe, and my friends believe. It is not a natural creature, and had something very different about it, a different kind of energy that I can't really describe. While the Sonoran Desert is beautiful and desolate at the same time, it holds a lot of beautiful plant life and very dangerous animal life, like rattlesnakes for one, and other dangerous animals. But what we encountered this day was something I had never heard of before, although some of my native friends believe they have heard of it, and that their elders have spoken of it and even warned about it. Now that I know these creatures exist, I'll be much more careful in my explorations of the desert and the areas that I dwell around. In fact, because of this, I'm not sure I even have much of an appetite for more adventuring in the desert. What I encountered that day is what I can only describe as large desert serpent beings that are more than triple the length of us. I'm talking easily 20 feet, if not longer in length, and large enough to swallow a man whole. These were gargantuan serpents, pale white and streaks of yellow and gold. Whatever these beings or serpents were, they came off as something unnatural. They carried a different energy around them, not like a typical animal you'd run into. So I don't want you to listen to this and think it's just some sort of snake we ran into. This had a totally different feel to it, and like I said, it had an energy to it, just like a foreboding energy, an omen, like you were not supposed to be around it, or that we had gone too far in an area we were not allowed to go into, which makes the entire event very interesting. At the time, nearly 14 years ago, my friends and I were not only exploring, but we had a destination in mind for our mission. One of my friends was told about a small little supposed burial ground not too far away. It sounded like it was unmarked, but it had a magic barrier around, or so we were told, and warned profusely not to go around there. My friends and I, although not being native myself, but they are, none of us really believed in that hocus pocus, or if we did, it was at a very ritualistic level, very minimal, and we never would have thought that something like this would have happened. I know, me saying this probably sounds incredibly far-fetched and out of reality, but I'm telling you, I have no desire to make something like this up. There's nothing that I can gain from it personally. My best assumption is that whatever these things were had to do in part with this burial ground that we were close to. Perhaps these things were summoned or called to be guardians of this place. I don't really know. We never really got answers, because after encountering these things, we were too scared to tell the people that told us not to go around there. So we kinda just kept it between ourselves. And even now, 14 years later, we've still kept it a secret, due to shame and punishment from our elders and our family. I can remember that it was a very hot day that day, just like every day in the desert, so there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But I can say the direction we were going, at the time, we weren't even sure if it was the correct way to go. We were kind of just guessing, based on the loose directions we had and where it was at, judging by the general area. And finally, after getting over a small hill and almost coming into a dip in the valley, and the best way I can describe it, I'm not great at describing land, so forgive me, but we got to this dip in a very small valley, where we could almost feel the energy around us shift, and I'm not the only one that noticed it. My two friends, who I won't give names to the story, have also noticed a change. We all looked at each other at once, and told each other we can feel something different in the air. I can't even begin to describe the feeling, but it was almost like a change in the air, like an electromagnetic feeling, but that's really hard to pinpoint. The only way you could ever know is if you experienced it yourself. It wasn't long after, before we felt shakes in the ground. I'm not talking about an earthquake. I'm talking about like something big moving underneath the ground. And that's when multiple of these things appeared. We felt the light rumbles underneath our feet, coming in our direction, when these large serpents, two of them, burst through the sand. Massive snakes. I have never in my life seen anything so big. The only thing I can draw somewhat of a comparison to is a game called Resident Evil 1, and somewhere in that game, the main character fights this really large snake. And if you go ahead and go on Google and look it up, you could probably find it. It's been forever since I played that game, but going by my memory, the snake, or boss, whatever it was, I believed was named Yawn, Y-A-W-N, just like a yawn you do when you wake up. Now, if you see a picture of this, obviously it's a fictitious game character, but that size should give you somewhat of a good idea. The snake in the game is obviously so large that it's fictional, and the snakes we saw weren't as big. They were smaller, significantly, but not overly small to where it didn't match up. I'm trying to give you this game character because it's the only thing I could really think matches up with the size of that description, at least close. So now that you have that in your head, think that, but a pale white color, with a yellow marking down its sides and back, and a head almost resembling that of a viper, with red-yellow glinting eyes. It looked mean, and while these snakes didn't necessarily come at us to try and devour us, I got the feeling that they easily could have, had they really wanted to. They slithered around us, encircling us, as if to give us a warning. It was almost like I got the feeling and vibe to go, and to not continue further. They continued to encircle us, almost like they were sizing us up, watching us before they made their move. At some point or another, all three of us began to bolt out of there and back the way we came, with these incredibly large serpents, still slithering around, looking at us, sizing us up, determining what their next move was to make. We didn't give it a chance. I don't know if their plan was to attack us, and they never tried. They never moved in close, or acted hostile in any way, although I do believe their entire output of emotion and energy was stay where you are, or leave now. Had I felt like we tried to press on, even with their presence, they would have struck us, and that would have been the death of either of us, I just feel. A snake of that size, that could have been the end of us. I can't even begin to tell you their venom output. That's pretty much all there is to my story, and I understand that I'm not a great storyteller by any means, and I'm not an author or writer, so this is just what you get. But I'm sure you get a lot of crazy stories, true and untrue, and I'm not here to spread false information. I'm here to tell you that there's things in the desert that we can't always be aware of or know they exist. And usually, if there's a place you're not allowed to go or forbidden to go into because of rumors or tradition, well, there's probably a reason for it, and I believe there's more there than just old wives' tales or superstitious junk. My friends and I certainly didn't tell anybody in our communities about this. Like I said in the beginning, I'm not native, so I didn't really have anybody to tell my story to, nor would they have believed me if I did. And my two friends, well, like I said, to this day, they've kept it a secret, because had they told their families or communities, they would have been punished, scolded, and severely reprimanded. I mean, after all, we were just dumb 16-year-old kids looking for an adventure, for a thrill. I'm not really one to believe in sea monsters or anything strange or that supposedly doesn't exist, like fairy tales or mermaids. But I had a very strange thing happen to me with my friend and I back in May when we went fishing outside the coast of Florida. I'm not an experienced fisherman by any stretch of the means, but I do enjoy fishing as a hobby, and so my buddy Ryan is a pretty good fisherman. He goes off coast fishing all the time. At least I believe it's called coast fishing. Well, that's what he calls it. So he's taken me a handful of times, but this time was just like any other time. And with the whole COVID thing going on, I figured a nice day fishing would have been good for both of us. Everything went pretty normal, up until a few hours after we were anchored, where we saw these large shapes start circling around our small boat. At first, I almost pondered if they were dolphins, but I thought dolphins come in bigger pods, and I don't know what kind and size they come in, but these seem to be a little bit bigger than a dolphin, and were shaped differently too. The weird thing was their behavior. They were shaped differently too, and they had a different color, if I'm making any sense at all. Like, they were dark. You couldn't really make out details, and they seemed to have long tails at the end of them, and they kept swimming in the groups of 3 that they came in. They would circle around our boat for a little bit, then swim out a little ways. Then they would swim back to us. It was strange, and I wasn't really sure what to make of it. Even my buddy Ryan was weirded out. We weren't sure what to do. We continued to cast our rods and just try and fish like normal, ignoring whatever these fish or marine life was. Well, they never got close enough to the surface that we were accurately able to see what they were. I'm gonna go with dolphins, but dolphins still don't act like that, nor do they swim like that. And these things, whatever they were, hung around our boat for probably 2 to 3 hours. We weren't dumping chum in the water at all, so I'm not too sure if they were just curious about our boat, or what. They never tried to jump on our lines either, so it wasn't the bait we had that was attracting them. It's still weird to think about. Now, it doesn't spook me, because I'm not scared, since I didn't see anything. But it's just, I don't know. I can't quite put a finger on it. My buddy even says that that was the weirdest, most strange fishing trip he's been on. And he's been on a lot of trips out into the ocean. At least with me, anyway. Not my story, but a close friend of mine's who's been fishing for well over 25 years in the Gulf of Mexico, the East Coast, and the West Coast as well, and has caught all sorts of fish, including sharks, and a host of other legal and illegal fish. I'm not going to sit here and parade and advocate for those who catch sharks, but he's done it before. I'll keep the backstory pretty minimal, but I just want you to know that he's caught his fair share of fish, and so when he catches something out of the ordinary, it's going to stand out in his mind. A few years ago, he was telling me, he caught something very strange off the coast of Texas. What he caught, he described as eel-like, being very long and having these strange tendrils off the tail of its body that almost hung out behind it, kind of like the tentacles of a jellyfish. Although they weren't jellyfish-like tentacles. It was a very strange-looking creature, he described. It was long like an eel, or like a serpent, but it didn't look like an eel. It kind of reminded him of a viperfish, and it was kind of bloated in the middle, and the length was around 8 to 9 feet in length, and about as thick as his torso. He said he had never seen a fish like it ever before, and wasn't exactly sure what to call it, or to classify it as. He took a picture, and sent it to one of his close fishing friends as well. They didn't know what the hell it was, and they had never seen anything like it either. But, him being him, didn't really put too much into it. He took it home, cut it up, and ate it, and apparently it didn't kill him. I kinda wish he would've kept the picture, or at least kept the fish, so we could show people. But with his type of personality, he's not really the type of person to catch a new species of fish, get all excited about it. He could honestly care less, whether he's seen it before or not. It's going on his grill and into his stomach. That's pretty much his attitude on it. With the whole quarantine thing going on lately, we ended up talking, and I somehow got on the topic of catching fish, and we talked about that for a while, in which I asked him what was the strangest catch he's ever had, and then that came to his mind and he told me about it. Anyway, I just thought I'd like to share this with you, since you might find it interesting. I wanted to send you this email because just recently, I happened to stumble across your video series about lake and sea monsters and was blown away by the amount of stories you've received from fellow fishermen and sea adventurers. Even though I may not be a fisherman or a sea adventurer by any means, I have many friends that are, and a couple off the top of my head that I know currently reside in England, and they have some crazy stories to tell. In fact, I'll have to put you in touch with them, because the stories they have will blow your mind. But there is one story that they shared with me recently, and although I might be terrible at retelling what they've told me, I can kind of tell you the gist of it. They were both fishing somewhere off the coast of England. I don't exactly know the location, because I don't quite remember if they relayed that to me. But they both told me something very large bumped the bottom of their boat, and then poked its head out of the water, probably not even 10 feet away, and looked at both of them. They were both shocked and scared. And keep in mind, this was a dinky little fishing boat. Not a tiny little wooden raft either, but definitely not a commercial fishing boat. They both described the creature to me as looking like some sort of aquatic dinosaur. It kind of resembled a sturgeon, is what they said, but had a very, very long neck and a tiny head that kind of looked prehistoric, is the best way they can describe it. It had its mouth open, but not in a menacing way, kind of just like how some fish or creatures have their mouth open. Whatever this thing was, it was close enough that they could tell it had tiny, serrated teeth and black eyes. It then dunked its head back under the water and continued as normal. Neither of them really have no idea why it bumped into their boat, or what exactly it was, and I don't think they ever really described to me what its body looked like. They just told me about how large it was. They're thinking that whatever this thing was, right when it bumped their boat, must have not realized that it did it, so that's why it stuck its head out of the water to kind of assess its surroundings, which is why it seemed to stare blankly at my two friends, and then resubmerge and continue on like nothing ever happened. They said its neck was incredibly long, easily 20 to 30 feet, and I'm not joking, it's not an exaggeration. They said it was much longer than a giraffe's neck, and the body of this thing had to have been massive, maybe 30 to 40 feet in length, and the neck was probably around 20 to 30. They said it reached high above the water, and the head was probably roughly the size of a human torso, maybe 3 feet from the edge of the mouth to the back of the neck. Again, this is all just rough speculation on their end, from what they saw about 20 feet away from this thing. They said it's almost impossible to know for absolute sure, but they said that's not the first time crazy stuff has happened off the coast of England. And while it is very frightening, they've assured me that weirder stuff has happened, and it's not the first time or the last they'll probably see something that isn't supposed to exist, or see something that we don't know about as mankind. I'm going to go ahead and keep their names anonymous, but one of them has a grandfather who's been a fisherman his entire life. He had a story in which years and years ago, I want to say it was back in the 70s or the 80s, his tiny ship was attacked by what they would describe as the Kraken. And I know that sounds kind of far-fetched, but the best way they put it into detail was it was some large octopi-like creature that was far larger than their boat, that literally tried to drag them down to the depths. Of course, when it was told to me, my mind immediately went to the whole Pirates of the Caribbean Kraken scene, but I really don't think it was that large, but it must have been of significant size to be able to try and take a boat down. So who knows? After all, there are all sorts of large predatory creatures in the ocean. Some that live so deep we'll never ever know about their existence. I don't want to make this too long, so I'll go ahead and reach out to my friends and have them send you over some amazing stories, and we'll see where we can go from there. But in the meantime, just try and stay out of the ocean. It's obvious that there are things living in there that we can't even comprehend. After all, mankind is very arrogant in what we believe we have discovered and what ceases to exist, only for a few years later to find out that that was a lie, and things actually do exist that we thought were long extinct. Back when I was 12 years old and in 7th grade, I was getting ready to go to my county's autumn festival with my friend, we'll call him Ethan, and his brother, who was a couple of years younger than us. Let's call him Danny. We were allowed to go by ourselves, so as long as we promised to return Ethan and Danny's house by 9 p.m. This was a pretty big deal, as their parents were considerably strict, to the point where they weren't even allowed to sleep with their friends when they spent the night, and their friends weren't allowed to sleep over on Saturday nights, unless they brought nice attire to wear to church the following morning. Since it was a Friday night, our plan was to hang out at the carnival and then have a sleepover at their house. It would be the first time our county would be hosting such a large-scale event. Well, large scale for where we lived, anyway. And practically everybody from school would be there. We were pretty excited and did not want to miss out. We were practically on our bikes as soon as school got out, grabbing things like snacks and money beforehand we went out. It took us about 40 minutes to get there, and by the time we arrived, the place was already considerably crowded. Even though the festival itself wasn't particularly special, I vividly remember everything I did there, and honestly, it's probably because my memory from that day was sharpened, as whole due to the experience later on in the night. Anyway, given the crowd, activities to do, and the rides to go on, it wasn't surprising that we eventually lost track of the time. We chained up our bikes and made our way into the festival. We had bought our tickets and decided to go on the rides first, as to not lose track of any candy or prizes we might have won. Danny had a fear of heights, so while I do feel bad for forcing him onto those rides in retrospect, it was funny at the time just to see his reactions to things such as Ferris wheels or the drop tower. He was a champ though, and kept up with us all through the night. We played typical carnival games like balloon pops, ring toss, hoops, and so forth. We won a lot of stuff that was basically just cheap, and eventually stopped to get something to eat. We found a hot dog stand and grabbed some popcorn while we were at it. We played some more games and explored a bit more before Ethan decided to check his phone and realized it was nearly 20 minutes until 9. We went back and forth in debating whether or not to call his parents and let them know we'd be late. But both he and Danny were scared that their parents would be mad if they found out that we hadn't been keeping track of time. We knew there was no way we could make it back in time if we went back the way we came. So, we ended up agreeing to take the shortcut through the bike path in the woods. We'd avoided going that way in the first place out of our own superstition. Like with any small town, myths of things like murderers and monsters came about from school kids, and most common and believed one being that of a crazy old man who lived in a small cabin, kidnapped people, especially children. Once he captured them, he'd scalp them alive and make curtains out of their hair. Everybody liked to act like they didn't believe in it, but it was enough to deter us from the forest under regular circumstances. Looking back, I'm pretty sure it was made up by somebody's parents or sibling, so they wouldn't have to worry about the children responsible for sneaking off into the forest. Regardless, Danny and Ethan were certain they had a 100% chance of being murdered by their parents, rather than a hypothetical lunatic in the woods. So, it was a pretty easy decision. We only had the light of the night sky and Ethan's flip phone to guide us. We were supposed to bring flashlights, but it was only then that we'd realized that we had simply forgotten them on the kitchen table. As quietly as we could, we made our way into the woods, and I was even yelled at for having a bit of a squeaky bike, as if it was something I could just fix right then and there. After a couple of minutes of going down the path and nothing happening though, we eventually started easing up a bit, even going as far as to tease each other and laugh about the alleged psychopath murderer that dwelled on the grounds. It stopped being funny as soon as we heard the cracking of sticks lightly echoing in the distance. We stopped in our tracks, breathing heavily, and I urgently whispered to Ethan to put his phone away. He did, and we continued to listen for anything new. Nothing happened, so we slowly continued to make our way through. I couldn't help but wince as my bike squeaked and squealed as it rolled forward. Eventually, Danny pointed the silhouette of something a few yards ahead. I looked towards it and made out the figure of a very large and muscular man with a nearly cartoonish proportions. However, there was something weird about his head. It took me a few moments to figure it out, but I realized it looked to be that of a dog's. Before I could even piece together what things might have been, it turned its head to us, revealing a warm, glowing red eyes. I think we were all too shocked and scared to scream. It continued to look at us, but it didn't move. Ethan started slowly moving closer to this creature, and I urged him to leave it alone. But he was absolutely fascinated. The creature spun around, back into the other direction, and seemed to walk off. Ethan began to speed up after it. Danny and I pleaded for him to stop, but before we knew it, Ethan was merely feet away from the thing. It whipped its body back around, letting out what I can only describe as a lion's roar from hell. He screamed and began to run down the path, and it chased after him full force. I can more easily make it out now. It was completely covered in thick black fur, pitch black fur to be exact, and it had long claws that seemed to be about a foot in length. It almost looked to have bad posture as it moved, as its spine seemed to be at an angle, but it didn't seem to be causing it any trouble while running after Ethan. In an effort to save Ethan, I took one of the prizes I'd won, a small inflated ball with a Spider-Man print, and threw it at this thing, hoping to distract it. It worked, and I didn't even take the time before I started running into the trees, yanking Danny along with me. We hid behind a log, watching as this monster paced up and down the bike path, the sight of its glowing eyes being visible just beyond the tree line. It didn't seem to know where we went, and as soon as it seemed far enough away, quietly as we could, we started moving to go and find Ethan. We eventually found him huddled near some shrubbery, gasping upon the sight of us, then letting out a sigh of relief. We talked as quietly as we could, but still ended up shushing each other. Eventually, we decided to move and slowly walked through the rest of the forest. I remember thinking about how I'd rather have stumbled across the crazy serial murderer instead. We immediately picked up our pace as soon as our neighborhood came into sight, and began to full-on sprint as we made our way past the trees. We urgently knocked on Danny and Ethan's house's door, and their mom opened up, angry as we were 20 minutes past our curfew, and that she'd called Ethan to no avail. We all tried to explain at once what had happened, but their mom was just confused. Eventually, Ethan explained and claimed there was no cell service in the woods, which was why he didn't receive her call. I didn't say it aloud, but I was grateful for that, as I knew the sound of the phone going off would alert of this creature's thing to Ethan's hiding spot, and who knows what could have happened to him if that were the case. Still, Their mother didn't take him seriously, or us. She grumbled about she had too long of work today and that she was too tired and went to bed. Once Danny and Ethan's dad came home, they told him about what had happened, figuring there was something he could do, and that since he was a cop. Not unlike their mother, he didn't seem to believe us, but he said he'd check it out in the morning and joined his wife in bed. We just decided to try and forget about it and watched a movie instead. Since his parents were so strict, we couldn't even view anything PG-13, as Ethan and I were still only 12. I found it almost morbidly funny, because I knew what we had experienced was far, far scarier than any R-rated horror movie. I was picked up early the following morning, but what I heard from Ethan in school on Monday was that when he and his dad visited the woods, they found all of our bikes absolutely destroyed and mangled, along with all the prizes from the carnival that we dropped while running away. His dad reported it to the other officers at the station, but our story was just treated as another tale to keep kids out of the woods. A lot of my classmates asked me about it, but instead of enjoying retelling it over and over again, I found that I didn't really want to talk about it. It stuck around though, and I was asked about it all the way up until I moved in my sophomore year of high school. By that point, I said the story was a joke or a prank to scare people, just like the psycho murderer tale. It did hurt my reputation, but I knew I was going to be leaving soon by then, so there wasn't much to lose. On top of that, it helped me get a sort of revenge on Ethan. During our freshman year, we had a falling out when he knowingly asked out the girl I liked. They ended up dating after that, and from then on, I used practically any opportunity I could just to smear his image, even if it meant taking myself down along with him. Of course, I think it's stupid now, and that I was far too dramatic and sensitive over the whole ordeal. The only reason I added this information is because Ethan recently popped up on my People You May Know while I was on Facebook. There's a theory that the algorithm makes it so that those who are consistently looking up at your profile pop up. So if that's the case, I'm curious about what made him want to do that after a full decade of us not speaking. He still seems to live in my hometown, and his profile is full of posts warning about demons and Judgment Day coming. I can't help but wonder if he saw the thing again. I guess I'll never know.